Hello and welcome. I'm Nadira Tudor and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya News headquarters. These are our top stories. The United States gives Ukraine permission to use long-range weapons to strike deep into the heart of Russia, a day after the largest airstrike on Ukraine in almost 3 months. It's a significant shift for Joe Biden's current government, with a warning that the decision could lead to a potential World War III. Meanwhile, no word from President Putin yet, as Russian dignitaries imply the West's direct link with the conflict could lead to heightened confrontation. Ukraine's attack on Russia could take place within a matter of days as Washington grants permission to strike using long-range missiles. It's thought Ukraine will initially concentrate on the Kursk region against both Russian and North Korean forces. For more on this, I'm joined by our correspondent, Megumi Lim, who's in Kyiv. Megumi, let's expand on what the New York Times is reporting. They're speculating that Ukraine will be likely to use US-supplied missiles against both Russian and potentially 11,000 North Korean troops in the Kursk region, according to Ukrainian officials. Tell us more.
Well, first of all, experts are saying that this policy reversal by Washington is not going to be a game changer, but it will help Ukraine achieve a number of things. First of all, these US-made long-range ATACMS missiles, which is part of this policy change, has a range of about 300 kilometers. That is 190 miles. And experts are saying that they will be useful in striking air bases that are located deep inside Russian territory. These are air bases that house the very fighter jets, the strategic bombers that have been responsible for carrying out devastating missile attacks against Ukraine, just like the attack that we saw on Sunday, one of the biggest aerial attacks of the war, where Ukraine's Air Force said that more than 40 Russian fighter jets were launched to carry out this attack that killed and injured dozens of civilians and also struck Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Now, the second thing is that these long-range strikes will also be able to hit Moscow's military logistics hubs, which will, of course, cripple Russia's war machine. This is, of course, crucial for Ukraine. As we have seen, the latest is that Russia has massed a force of about 50,000 soldiers in its Kursk region, which includes reportedly 10,000 North Korean soldiers. And Russia is preparing to launch a major counteroffensive there to try to push out Ukrainian troops from its Kursk region, the 600 square kilometers of territory that Kyiv was hoping could be used as a potential bargaining chip if and when talks did take place with Moscow in the future. Now, the last thing is that experts are saying, also analysts are saying, that this policy change could also send a strong message to North Korea to not send any more North Korean soldiers to help in Russia's war in Ukraine. But also, in terms of, if we're talking about stockpiles, Ukraine has already used some of these ATACMS missiles against targets, military targets in Russian-occupied Crimea. And so we do not know how many ATACMS missiles Ukraine has left in their arsenal. And we also do not know whether the United States will be able to send more to Ukraine.
Thank you, Megumi. And it seems that this could be a crucial move, couldn't it, for the ability to reciprocate. And obviously, this development also affects other international players. Some will agree with the US administration and others won't. The UK and France have approved the use of long-range missiles, according to a Le Figaro report. How true is this, and why would they support such a move?
Well, the British and French militaries have already sent their long-range Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles to Ukraine. These missiles have a range of about 155 miles or 250 kilometers, which is less than the U.S.-supplied ATACMS, but nevertheless, they can go for long distances. Already, British and French leaders have voiced support towards Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's request to use these missiles, but they have been hesitating to lift restrictions because U.S. President Joe Biden has not, in the past, did not want to lift restrictions on the U.S. supplied ATACMS, and this has been sort of the direction that weapons policy has been headed. The U.S. has been the benchmark for these policies, and countries like Britain and France has been looking to the United States for the signal or permission to lift these restrictions. However, this Le Figaro report that we saw earlier today has been retracted. We have not seen an official confirmation by neither Britain or France as to whether they've officially lifted restrictions. We are likely going to be seeing this policy change actually in the shape of an actual missile strike being launched by Ukraine against a Russian military target, as Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said in his evening address on Sunday. He said the missiles will speak for themselves.
Okay, Megumi Lim there in Kyiv. Thank you very much for that update. Thank you. Kyiv and Washington have largely welcomed the US decision to allow Ukraine to use American-made long-range missiles to strike inside Russia. The stunning shift in US policy comes just ahead of a change of president, with Donald Trump vowing he'll end the war soon after taking office. Nick Harper reports from Washington.
A long-shot, long-range attempt to change the trajectory of the conflict. Ukraine will now have the ability to hit further into Russia, striking tactically important areas. In Kyiv, there's relief, but also questions as to why it took the US so long to give its approval.
It may mean additional points for Biden from his American voters, but for Ukrainians, this is a little too late.
It gives Kyiv greater range and strength, but most analysts don't see it swinging the war decisively in Ukraine's favour.
You are hugely limiting Russia's ability to mobilize against you and to attack. So it's an enormous step. The Ukrainians are hugely relieved, but it's not a game changer as far as the war is concerned.
The change in US policy comes just 2 months before Joe Biden leaves office. With Biden weeks away from his White House exit, this could be about trying to bolster his own foreign policy legacy. But with Donald Trump promising to stop military funding to Ukraine, this is also about shoring up Kyiv's stockpiles. Trump has vowed to end the war on his first day back in office. There's speculation he may force Ukraine to cede territory to Russia. One former US ambassador believes Biden's decision strengthens Kyiv's hand in potential peace talks.
You have to put your side in as strong a position militarily or tactically as possible. And of course that would mean, you continue to provide support militarily in preparation for any kind of negotiated solution.
Western allies are expected to follow Washington's lead. The European Union's foreign policy chief is pushing more nations to agree.
I've been saying once and again that Ukraine should be able to use the arm we provided to them in order to not only to stop the arrow, but also to be able to hit the Arcas.
Tuesday marks 1,000 days of fighting, a milestone many never expected. Now, this long-range missile decision could push the conflict into even more dangerous and more unpredictable territory. Nick Harper, Arabiya News, Washington.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined from Washington by Ilya Ponamarev, a former Russian MP and political representative of the Russian Armed Resistance, which are groups of Russian exiles, just to explain, fighting with Ukraine against Putin. Welcome to the programme, Ilya. Now, Joe Biden's decisions to allow Ukraine to use US-supplied long-range missiles inside Russia is a huge policy shift. Why do you think this move has been made?
I think that Mr. Biden is concerned about his legacy. He was so many times accused of indecisiveness and passiveness and being slow in response to the challenges at the front lines, that he was always reacting on more and more escalation that is coming from Moscow, at the same time repeating mantras that he is against any escalation. So right now he wants to leave something behind him so that the new administration has to build on something.
It's a bold move, isn't it, to make that decision about the indecision, as you mentioned, 2 months before stepping down?
Frankly speaking, I think it really doesn't matter already at the moment, because it was discussed throughout the whole 2024, and throughout this year, Ukrainians have already developed long-range drone capacity, which is way longer strikes than what we are talking about right now. And Ukrainian drones can reach not only Moscow, it can reach even some locations in Urals, which is way further to the east. Obviously, ballistic missiles like Atacams, they carry more explosives, but at the end of the day, I think that this decision has more symbolic meaning than the actual game changer at the field of battle.
Now, President Volodymyr Zelensky has reacted to the news now, a result for him surely, as he's been pleading for more support to help him defeat Putin. What has his reaction been to the news?
Obviously, it was very reassuring, because right now there are a lot of speculations in the global media, also fueled a lot by Russians, that America is about to give up on Ukraine and that the ceasefire is coming, and that the ceasefire would be extremely unprofitable for Ukrainians. And even some people inside Ukraine, they start to say that we are about to face a betrayal of the global community on Ukrainians. And that's why this move obviously, brings some high spirits to the nation, and for that we are very thankful.
Do you think it's bringing high spirits as well as hope?
Yes, that's absolutely true. And right now there is a debate what would in general happen in 2025. Right now, Putin is elevating pressure on Ukraine by attacking more and more energy infrastructure, and he understands that the winter is coming, so he wants Ukrainians to sit without power, without heat, without water, and obviously every bits and pieces of inspiration is very helpful in these dark days.
Now, your group, the Free Russia Legion, understands Russia well, obviously, and you've been involved in several attacks into Russian territory. How do you think Kyiv will now use these weapons?
Well, I think that indeed, and that's what most likely Americans encourage Ukrainians to do, is to attack Northern Koreans, which were dispatched in Kursk region alongside the border. And I think that that's what would happen in the near future. But if we want to make a game changer in this war, we obviously need to attack the houses of the riches, the houses of members of Putin's elites, to generate split within the enemy's ranks, because right now everybody in Moscow considers this war as not something that threatens them personally.
There obviously are concerns within the international community about the war escalating further, and there will be a cost. Are we going to see the two sides, for 2 months now before, the US changes their leader, as it were, spiraling on both sides? Ukraine supported by the US and potentially other countries, Western countries, and Russia supported by North Korea and Iran until Trump takes that hot seat.
I think that those concerns, they are rather hypocritical, because what could be more than Ukraine entering the territory of Russia, the Kursk region, and keeping this territory under its control for already for 3 or it's fourth month of this operation, and no escalation happened. Russia did not react in any special way to it, besides just some empty threats which originally were that we will return the region under our control in a week. Then it was in a month. Now Putin said, okay, we'll try to return it by the time Trump gets into the office, or by the end of January. So they are pushing more of deadlines because they are unable to escalate. They do understand that the nuclear is not an option because it's suicidal for the current inhabitants of the Kremlin, but they have nothing else. So that's why it's just empty threats. And we need to understand that the only way to proceed and the only way to secure Europe, the only way to stop the bloodshed is by destroying Putinism.
Ilya Ponamarev, former Russian MP and political representative of the Russian armed resistance. Really fascinating and interesting to have you on the programme. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Biden's decision to support Ukraine's strike into Russia has been met with fury in Russia. The Russian government newspaper Rossiyskaya Gazeta called it the most provocative, uncalculated decision of his administration, which risks catastrophic consequences. For more now, I'm joined from Moscow by our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova. Dasha, really strong words there that we've seen in the response to this. Have we had a response from Putin about Biden's latest decision to allow Ukraine to use their long-range missiles in Russia? And if not, why not?
Well, we've heard the Kremlin saying that President Vladimir Putin has long outlined the Russian position, and that this decision to allow Ukraine to strike Russia with long-range missiles is actually another round of escalation, a very dangerous escalation that is taking place at the moment. We are hearing Moscow insist that that means increased NATO involvement into the conflict in Ukraine, because Moscow explains Ukraine is simply unable to use these types of weapons without the intelligence, without the surveillance, without the officers from these Western countries. So it means that these Western countries, the US in particular, is involved itself in this conflict, and this is changing the nature of this conflict. According to the officials at the Kremlin, they also know that because of the changed nature, there would be the changed response from the Russian side. They all say that this response, should these weapons actually be used in practice, this response will be appropriate to the new threats created.
This has been the narrative, hasn't it, that's been, before this decision was made, that has been suggested from the Russian administration for some time about NATO's potential involvement in this. Is there, however, any acknowledgement from the Russian administration that their actions might have been provocative and retaliation of this nature might perhaps have been inevitable?
Well, from the Russian side, it is the West that fails to understand the root causes of the conflict in Ukraine. And repeatedly, we hear the Russian officials insist that these are the root causes. This is the NATO encroachment and the larger issues concerning security architecture in Europe that have to be addressed and understood clearly by the Western politicians. And therefore, in Russia, this narrative has prevailed. At the same time, we have heard also the Western officials and the Western media all saying that this decision has been made in response to the allegations that North Korean troops could be used in Russia's Kursk region in the area of the special military operation as well. And Moscow, with regard to that, has always been saying that it is not violating any sort of international sanctions when it comes to its partnership with North Korea, and also insisted that it is going to use, as it sees fit, the Article 4 of the Strategic Partnership Agreement that has been signed and ratified by Moscow and Pyongyang. So in Moscow, there is a very clear rhetoric that it is the Western countries that have to understand that they cannot pump up Ukraine with weapons forever, and that they will have to make sure that Ukraine gets to the negotiating table. While these decisions about the use of long-range weapons are not helping to get the negotiated settlement to the conflict, military and political analysts here have all been saying that instead of any chance of getting to the negotiating table, we have had some modest signs, such as the phone call between President Vladimir Putin and German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. All these modest steps could actually be in vain, because should Russia actually respond to this US decision, then certainly we are very far away from any prospect of ceasefire talks.
Given that the Russian administration is very clear about the rhetoric, how is the Russian media reporting this U-turn? State TV, Russia Today, etc. What's being said?
Well, the main line we are getting from the Russian media that it is a very dangerous and escalatory move on the part of the Western countries, but also they say that it was the move by the old outgoing administration in the United States, a sort of revenge for the new administration that will be coming in January, administration of Donald Trump, who had himself said that he could end this conflict in a day once he takes office. So the clear picture in the Russian media is that this is a sort of a calculated move in order to allow these negotiations to actually take place, not to allow the plans of Donald Trump to take shape in reality. And also they say that it is the legacy of Joe Biden that Donald Trump will have to deal with, and that's why the outgoing administration is trying to make it harder. That has been the main line we got from the Russian media.
Dasha Chernyshova in Moscow. Thank you very much for the update. Thank you. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making the news around the world. Israel's military has killed 20 Palestinians across the Gaza Strip today, including 6 people living in tents being used by displaced families. 4 people, 2 of whom were children, were killed in an Israeli airstrike in the area of Al-Mawasi, which is being used as a humanitarian zone. The others were killed in temporary shelters in Rafah. At least 8 people have died after Super Typhoon Manyi hit the Philippines over the weekend, resulting in landslides caused by strong winds and heavy rain. Manyi is the country's 6th storm to hit the area in the last month. Pollution readings in New Delhi have hit their highest number of the season today. As toxic smog continues to cover northern India, at least 11 flights were diverted, with airports and railway stations experiencing delays. The country's chief minister has called it a medical emergency. And Russian ballet dancer Vladimir Shekolярov has died after reportedly falling off a balcony building whilst under the influence of painkillers for a back injury. The 39-year-old principal dancer was one of the world's most talented ballet stars. The UK had been expected to follow the United States' decision to allow Ukraine to launch long-range missiles into Russia. But so far, a Downing Street spokesperson has refused to confirm an agreement had taken place. Now, we've heard murmurs about the UK possibly following in America's footsteps in supporting their use of their own Storm missiles. We have Olly Barratt here on the line now to give us an update. Olly, can you give us an update on that question?
Yeah, that's right. The Downing Street is still refusing to confirm or deny whether an agreement has been reached for the use by Ukraine of the Storm Shadow missiles that the UK and France could supply to the Ukrainians to strike targets deeper inside Russian territory. Now, it has been put to Downing Street this afternoon, reporting in the British media, which suggests that actually any delay in that regard is potentially coming from Washington rather than from London or Paris. The reporting in the British media is that it is Joe Biden's administration which is still hesitant in signing off the use of those British and French Storm Shadow missiles, which Kyiv is so keen to use, as I say, deeper inside Russian territory than it has been able to up to now. Downing Street insisting that one type of equipment isn't going to win the war, but not confirming or denying anything really about the status of the Storm Shadow ask from Kyiv. A spokesperson for the Prime Minister today saying that our support in Ukraine is ironclad and will continue on that basis. But when asked about the specifics of operational support, we won't get into speculation, said the spokesperson, or a commentary on operational discussions. We also heard from the UK Defence Secretary earlier, John Healey, who was asked about this very topic in the UK's House of Commons, and he also wouldn't get into those details, saying that if he did so, it could compromise operational security.
Well, it's clear that they're not willing to tell us either way then, is it, Olly? Well, we have also been hearing as well that Germany have been sending 4,000 drones, which Ukraine ordered from a company called Helsing in September, to Ukraine in a top-secret delivery, confirmed by the German Defence Secretary, Boris Pistorius. How significant is this?
I think that would be seen as significant by the Ukrainians, partly because of the types of drones that this signifies. They have the ability to use artificial intelligence when it comes to their direction. They can therefore be operational over long distances and, crucially, in difficult weather and conditions, and can even strike their targets even if communication with these drones is disrupted or lost in some way. So again, the Ukrainians will certainly see this as a boost to their efforts when it comes to the conflict with Russia. And it's the kind of thing, as I say, that the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has been asking for from Germany specifically, but from other Western allies. And we're seeing many of those Western allies really come together with fresh offerings for the Ukrainians, particularly with one eye on Washington and the knowledge that the Donald Trump presidency may take a slightly different stance to that which we've seen from Joe Biden during his period in the White House, during which the conflict has been ongoing. So just another example of Ukraine's allies trying to do what they can to step up with further support heading into the winter.
Olly Barratt in London, thank you for the update. Thank you. Chinese President Xi Jinping has vowed to work with the incoming US administration of Donald Trump as he held his final talks with outgoing President Joe Biden in Lima, Peru, where both leaders attended the APEC summit. President Xi Jinping told Biden that the issues of Taiwan, democracy, human rights and rights to develop are red lines for China and not to be challenged. Laura Westbrook is in Hong Kong for us. Laura, what was discussed at the meeting?
Well, this was essentially a farewell chat between President Xi Jinping and President Joe Biden. President Xi was really trying to lay down some guardrails, if you like, to the relationship. And he said that there were 4 red lines that, according to state media, should not be challenged. Now, these 4 red lines are that the US should not try to undermine the Communist Party's grip on power in China, that the US should not try to push China to become a democracy or try to contain China's economic rise, and perhaps most importantly, that the US should not support Taiwanese independence. Now, with an incoming Trump presidency, that does bring with it a lot of uncertainty. And so it does seem to appear that President Xi is trying to lay down some guardrails and send a clear message to Donald Trump on what his red lines are. Now, Joe Biden and Xi Jinping also discussed areas of cooperation, such as artificial intelligence, with both leaders agreeing on the need to maintain human control over any decision to use nuclear weapons. And for his part, Joe Biden also pressed President Xi Jinping to use his influence with Russia to prevent a further expansion of the war in Ukraine.
President Xi is now in Brazil for the G20 meeting. What can we expect there?
Well, in Peru, President Xi sought to shore up ties with a range of US allies and partners, and he's set to continue a bit of a charm offensive and more talks with more of them at the G20 in Rio de Janeiro. In Peru, he warned that the global economy was fracturing as protectionism spreads. So he's really trying to cast himself as a protector of free trade. This comes as US President-elect Donald Trump is set to take office. He's threatening 60% tariffs on China and 10 to 20% on the rest of the world. And so with these global tariffs, it does appear to give President Xi a bit of an opening to try to improve relations with other governments and build on existing ties. Now, according to state media, President Xi expressed his readiness to work with all parties to create a multipolar world and for inclusive economic globalization. He also added on his hopes that the G20 could play a greater role in international economic cooperation.
Laura Westbrook in Hong Kong, thank you. Let's have a look at some of the business headlines now. The Russia-Ukraine conflict over the weekend has affected the cost of oil as prices increased today. Brent crude futures were up 55 cents, that's $71.59 a barrel, whilst US West Texas Intermediate crude futures were up 43 cents, that's $67.45 a barrel. Meanwhile, the price of olive oil across Europe is expected to halve in the coming months. Spanish company Diolelo, which owns brands like Bertolli and Carbonell, said droughts and extreme heat in southern Europe had been affecting production costs. Record-breaking 80 million Americans are expected to travel for Thanksgiving next week, according to travel group AAA. 1.7 million more people will make the journey on Tuesday, the 26th of November, to Monday, the 2nd of December, compared to last year. In sport, Tottenham Hotspur player Rodrigo Bentancur has been slapped with a 7-match ban after making an alleged racist remark about his South Korean teammate Son Heung-min. The midfielder was previously charged by the FA in September after giving an interview on the Uruguayan TV channel Canal 10 in June. And tennis star Rafael Nadal says he will not become distracted with emotion as he prepares to bid farewell during this week's Davis Cup. The former world #1 and 22-time Grand Slam champion will retire from the sport after representing Spain at the men's team event in Malaga. Let's give you a reminder of today's top stories. The United States gives Ukraine permission to use long-range weapons to strike deep into the heart of Russia, a day after the largest airstrike on Ukraine in almost 3 months. It's a significant shift for Joe Biden's current government, with a warning that the decision could lead to a potential World War III. Meanwhile, no word from President Putin, as Russian dignitaries imply the West's direct link with the conflict could lead to heightened confrontation. That's it from all of us at W News. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned now for Tom Burges Watson with GNT. Good night.
Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News.
It's very impressive.
Where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome. I'm Riz Khan. He's been described as the most dangerous philosopher in the West, and he certainly doesn't hold back any punches. But there's no denying that Slavoj Zizek provokes deep thought and discussion with his often controversial views on everything from the state of politics in the mainstream media to the meaning of real love, and now the validity of religion, through his new book with the provocative title, Christian Atheism, How to Be a Real Materialist. Well, keeping an eye on things from US politics as well as the conflicts between Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Hamas, Professor Zizek sees a world where we can only start to understand what's going on once it starts to disintegrate, and where, quote, good old capitalism isn't what it used to be. I spoke with the man some see as a celebrity philosopher to find out more. Professor Zizek, it's really good to have a chance to chat with you. It's been a number of years, but glad to be with you. I want to start by asking, I love some of the titles that you have been given over the years, a couple of which I quoted in the introduction to you. Celebrity philosopher, but also the most dangerous philosopher in the West, and you've even been labelled the Elvis of cultural theory. How do you regard such titles?
I think I ignore them, but what makes them interesting is that they unite the opposites. I'm at the same time a clown, enjoying obscene jokes, not to be taken seriously, and a dangerous either imperialist or anti-Zionist subversive. What this demonstrates is how it's not simply today the task to pick choices. The whole space of the choices we are facing is in some sense a false space. That's what worries me.
You described Donald Trump as, quote, the ultimate postmodern relativist cynical politician. What did you mean by that?
I mean this. I'm very glad that you mentioned this, because I'm proud of this designation. Trump, of course, flirts with Christian fundamentalism and so on. But look at how he acts, how he talks, his other gestures and so on. He is self-ironical. He makes fun of himself. He doesn't care if he is caught lying. He uses, I will not repeat them because it would be too obscene, all the dirty, obscene, sexualized designation of opponents and so on and so on. So this self-relativization and so on, and this lack of dignity, this is postmodernist. Just compare Trump to Bernie Sanders. Isn't Bernie Sanders, as a person, not privately, but let's say his public persona, isn't he a good, old-fashioned, moral majority person? He never goes into vulgarities, he acts with shame, he retains his dignity. So when we hear these critiques of postmodernity, my answer is, sorry, but Donald Trump, with his constant mocking, you cannot catch him, he always finds a way out, pure sophism and so on, he is the true postmodern president.
But it seems that divisiveness in society... Sorry, I was just going to say, it seems that the divisiveness in society, especially in American society, is reaching extremes. It seems that celebrity plays a bigger part than policies when it comes to electing leaders, not just actually in America, but many parts of the world. Why do you think society has slid down that slippery path?
I think, again, it's a risky, extreme hypothesis, but I think that somewhere in the 90s, with what Fukuyama wrongly called the end of history, at least in the Western world, wars became predominantly cultural wars on both sides. The right wing against abortion, portraying the opponent as corrupted, moral relativism, the leftists with their politically correct obsessions. What is disappearing is politics as such in the authentic sense. And I think that the new religious fundamentalists are precisely a return of politics proper. It's wrong politics, but religious fundamentalists in some sense resuscitated politics as passionate enjoyment. Passionate engagement. While all that the other side, liberals, can oppose it is some expert rule, neutral technocracy combined with this politically correct moralism. I think this is an ultimate deadlock.
It seems quite often, though, Professor, that politics is less relevant. Well, I was going to say, it seems that politics is sometimes less relevant because research is showing that many societies are now looking for strong leaders, and that might explain the popularity of someone like Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. First of all, I wonder if you see them as strong leaders in the first instance, and how perhaps society is gravitating towards these kind of strong figures that they want in power.
I agree with you, although I would add that it's more ambiguous. Like, take Trump. Yes, he is authoritarian and so on. But for me, the basic characteristic of an authentic, and I believe in them, authentic strong leader is dignity and this spontaneously emanating authority. Trump is not that. Trump plays a strong leader, but he plays it in an ironic way, making fun of himself and so on and so on. Even with Putin, you can find something similar. He is not dignified. He, from time to time, goes into obscenities and so on. So it's very sad what is happening. I am not some kind of anarchist leftist. Sometimes an authentic, strong leader is needed, and today it is. By authentic, strong leader, I don't mean the one who is a dictator and just tells you what is better for you than you yourself know. No, an authentic, strong leader shakes you, moves you. He makes you feel, yes, we can do this. He opens a new space, a hope. We don't get such strong leaders today.
Now, I know, Professor, you're not a fan of Vladimir Putin, but can you sympathize in any way with the position of President Putin against military expansion on his doorstep, especially with Ukraine's ambition to be part of NATO? The narrative, of course, in the West is very much against him, but can you see his point of view?
Here, maybe I will disappoint you. I see his point of view, of course, but nonetheless, I have so many friends, not just in Ukraine, but in Baltic countries and so on, so that I don't accept this simple narrative that Ukrainians are engaged in a, let's call it, as usually said, proxy war of NATO against Russia. I think if you look at what goes on in last decades, Russian intervention in Georgia, Georgia, then Crimea occupation, and so on. Just read. I do regularly. I can read passively Russian. I follow their own ideology. It's clear that it's not even some remainder of Soviet Union. It's simply imperial ambition. What I find crucial is that in his two speeches, in 22, when Putin announced intervention in Ukraine, 21st and 23rd of February, he only critically mentioned in each speech one name, Lenin. He even said that Ukraine should be renamed Ukraine of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. So he is really returning to the Tsarist imperial tradition of Russian Empire, where Ukrainian national sovereignty, right to be a state of its own, is negated. I'm very critical towards many things going on in Ukraine. Corruption goes on, economic catastrophe, and so on. But nonetheless, I think when we put pressure on Ukraine, be more for peace and so on, let's face what is their choice. Their choice is not peace of war. Their choice is we resist Russia or we disappear as a nation. Russia is repeatedly saying it, is doing it in the parts of Ukraine it occupies. So I am for peace, for a compromise. But let's be clear, without the Western help, Ukraine would not even be in a position to negotiate for peace. It's precisely the fact that Ukraine was able to resist fast Russian victory which enables serious negotiations for peace. But if I may make here another point, what really worries me is that with the catastrophic Western politics, where they all the time give serious warnings to Israel but put no serious pressure on Israel, what Putin is doing with BRICS, he is now constituting a new bloc so that the opposition will be developed West versus Palestinians and so on, and Ukraine will find itself on the West, as if you defend Ukraine, if you are for Ukrainian defense, you are for Western imperialism, to cut a long story short. And so Putin is, I think, winning in the so-called third world, Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and that's for me the true catastrophe.
Okay, that's what's interesting, Professor, because, of course, what we've seen with both the Ukraine and Russia situation and the Israel-Hamas situation is what seems to be a realignment of alliances across the globe. And BRICS, of course, is coming up, and many of the BRICS countries seem to take a different position. Do you see a split on the world stage along East-West ideological lines, not in the sense of the Cold War, but more in the sense of those alternatives, such as the BRICS bloc, to that long-running domination of the US and the West in setting global agendas?
I agree with you, and I am, of course, for a more authentic, multicentric world. What worries me is just this, that in many BRICS countries, not all, what we in the West nonetheless propose as feminist rights, religious rights, and so on, is now proclaimed as Western imperialism. What do I mean by this? The saddest example for me that I often use is, you must know that in Uganda a year and a half or a year ago, their parliament almost unanimously endorsed the toughest anti-gay legislation. It goes up to death penalty. You know what was their justification? That gay rights, this is Western imperialist ideological colonization. So that's what makes me afraid, that our struggle for women's rights and so on will be located as a remainder of neo-imperialism against third world BRICS, but then BRICS is a strange thing. Did you notice that, I think a couple of weeks ago, Putin acknowledged Taliban and today's Afghanistan as a progressive ally of Russia in the struggle against Western terrorism and so on. So the situation is, again, what I fear most, is the one of false oppositions.
Professor, are these conflicts, such as the Israel versus Hamas and the Ukraine versus Russia, is it that it's bringing the world split along similar lines? Is there a common theme here?
Yeah, but how? That's the problem for me. How do you draw the line? I absolutely don't agree that Ukraine is like Israel. No, I think that first, let me say briefly something about Hamas and so on. For me, what is totally obliterated, although it was publicly demonstrated, as far as I know, I listen to the words of Smotrich and others, it is that we should always bear in mind that till, I think 2 years ago or when, Israel financially supported Hamas, because they wanted Palestinians split. So I think that in the long term, I of course condemn the criminal terrorist attack of Hamas, but in the long term, Israel needed, that's my analysis, needed this new war to create a greater Israel. It's happening now, we see it. Ethnic cleansing of Gaza, West Bank, and so on and so on. Who knows where they will stop? So I think You know, remember when Hamas Gaza attack was done, every interview that I gave, the first question was, let's clarify, do you condemn Hamas attack or not? Now the question should be asked, where do you stand about what is happening now in northern Gaza? If you don't absolutely condemn it, rational conversation is over. Another thing that depresses me immensely, it's the ethical decay. I hope our viewers and listeners know what happened. It was, I think, about 2 months ago when in Knesset there was a debate about what happened in some camps south of Jerusalem, not far further south in Sinai, where some Israeli guards escaped in shock and rendered it public, even with some video clips, that Palestinians there are tortured in an unspeakable way. Big metal sticks with needles up their rectum and so on. You know what shocked me? I'm a pessimist. I know everybody is doing such things, but that we debate, not only we debated this publicly, but the majority in the parliament simply said this is part of our struggle against Arab terrorism. So brutal torture is publicly declared, defended. I mean, in such a situation, I prefer hypocrisy, because hypocrisy means that you are at least a little bit ashamed of what you are doing. But when struggle for Israeli self-defense becomes a publicly admitted horrible mode of torture, then it's over.
You know, Professor, one thing I want to ask is, in the case of Israel versus Hamas, the conflict is often, especially by the Israeli side, positioned as Jewish versus Muslim, and any question of Israel's military action, its consequences, is labeled as anti-Semitic. Now, how do you regard that narrative that pushes a religious agenda over what is essentially a land dispute? And where do you see it all ending? Is there going to be a greater Israel, the way you described Israel's ambitions?
I think that the only way to understand the situation is to draw another line of distinction. I see paradoxically Hamas and Israel on the same side, because they both see war, brutal violence as the only way to solve the situation. Israel, I think, is fully aware that what it is doing now in Gaza, and for me the key is always West Bank, will give birth to new forms of anti-Semitism. But Israel accepts this because then it will be even more able to present itself as a victim of anti-Semitism and so on. So we should always bear in mind this. And you know whom I here really respect? I have a long respect for my communist time. Do you know who is Ami Ayalan, the ex-chief of Shin Bet? He said at the beginning, the only way out is to give Palestinians under our control some political freedom, dignity, autonomy, recognize them as belonging to this space. And then he even made a quite rational proposal that Marwan Barghouti, who is now in prison there, should be set free because he is for two-state solution, not openly terrorist now, and he can beat Hamas in free elections. This is our situation where, when I repeated what Ami Ayalan publicly said in a couple of interviews at the beginning of this war, I was interrupted by shouts of I support Hamas, I'm pro-terrorist, and so on and so on. Isn't this a sad time when the only one who clearly dares to say the truth are ex-leaders of Shin Bet and Mossad? Here is where we are.
You know, Professor, it's also, it seems that any kind of questioning or protesting at the people level is an issue. The government seemed to set the narrative, certainly in the West. How do you regard the way pro-Palestinian protests were handled in various Western countries, the USA, the UK, much of Europe, in terms of the police and military force used to suppress them?
I totally agree with you. Even my many Jewish friends supported the protests, like my good friend James Shamus, who was a movie producer and so on. I think that behind this particular phenomenon, we should admit a very sad fact. The liberty of the press of saying things in public space is gradually disappearing. Censorship is reasserting itself on both sides. We know what the new right is doing in the United States. You know how many books are prohibited in elementary and high schools, from Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer to Moby Dick. They claim, I had to quote, that Moby Dick, the title is obscene, like erected penis or what, so let's prohibit it. The politically correct left is engaged in this. So it's, I think, why is such a stance dangerously authoritarian? Because it is based on a deep mistrust of ordinary people, as if ordinary people can be so easily seduced that if we don't tightly control what information they get, they will be automatically, they will choose the wrong side and we are lost. So again, I think that the era of liberalism as we know it is getting over, and my big dilemma is how to avoid the obvious solution, capitalist state with a strong traditional narrative at its support, what I call soft fascism, how to prevent that this will be the predominant mode. This is happening in India, Modi, wild capitalism, but at the same time Hindu nationalism. This is happening in China. Xi, their boss, gave a speech which was, I think, extremely important. Around a month ago, he spoke about the need to re-educate the young generation. Then I expected that he will say, read Mao, communism. No, he said great Confucian tradition. So my problem is that many of anti-Eurocentric, so-called third world country, but China is not third world in any meaningful, I mean outside Europe, while they are so critical of Europe, they are taking over what I think is the worst thing of European tradition, a strong nation state.
You know, Professor, going back to what you said about quoting past leaders and the response, the heckling you got, you've also commented, to quote you, "You can say the truth today, but it doesn't awaken us." So has society discarded the idea of critical thinking to establish fact versus fiction? And if so, what's happened to, to truth and the importance of the truth? Free speech.
This now, I'm sorry, we don't have time to go into these more theoretical matters, but this is crucial what you touched now. I call this in psychoanalytic terms the logic of disavowal. You don't deny truth. You are open to truth, but you formulate it in such a way that it doesn't really oblige you to do. It doesn't subjectively engage you. Take ecology. Everybody knows we are in danger, blah, blah, blah. But the more we talk about it, the less we do. I think the battle against global warming is already lost. And it's the same at all levels. Against war, everybody is against war, but like in the case of Israel, Israel is getting serious warnings, Western powers are worried, but they do nothing. They unconditionally, at the level of arms delivery and so on, support Israel. So again, the predominant logic today is a kind of a cynical disavowal. It's no longer the good old-fashioned lying, you deny the truth, because then you can at least counter-attack. The logic is, as they say in French, je sais bien mais quand même. I know very well, but. I know the situation is very serious, but listen, we will get somehow out, don't take it too seriously, and so on. I think the predominant danger today is not so much a fundamentalist, fanatical engagement, it is this cynical indifference. If you have the cynical, indifferent stance towards our situation, you are an ideal subject.
Professor, you know, the cynical indifference...
no threat.
I was going to ask you, that cynical indifference you just referred to, one of the criticisms of many societies now is they tend not to even try to decipher fact from fiction, and that many blame the media for misinforming the public, while others blame social media. Is there still actually any objectivity out there?
I am here an old-fashioned Eurocentric partisan of truth. Yes, I still believe in truth, not only in truth at the level of facts, like it's important to know what goes on. All my friends who claim, but aren't we too critical of Israel? I always gave them a couple of websites where you can see drone shots of Gaza, and you just go on, you see the... So facts are important. Second thing is that I don't believe in simple neutrality. For me, I'm here an old-fashioned theological materialist. Truth is a category of subjective engagement. You cannot write a history of Auschwitz or Gulag or whatever without being morally shocked by it. I believe that truth hurts, and that to tell the truth, you, again, are not allowed to occupy a neutral position. You must be shocked and engaged.
Yeah, Professor, the problem with this aspect of truth is perception seems to get in the way a lot. And one of the big battles played out in both mainstream and social media focuses on, for example, the so-called woke culture, which kind of redefines so much and complicates so much. What do you make of woke culture?
Of course, I accept the basic idea, how much our history is twisted and so on and so on. For example, Churchill was not simply Winston Churchill, the ideal World War II leader. We know one of the worst chapters then in, I think, 43, 44. He consciously allowed a big hunger. Millions died in Bengal, so that the food was taken for British soldiers for the offensive against Burma, today Myanmar. So yes, all this should be brought out. Nonetheless, where I have a problem is that, you know, monuments from the past, although they are not true in the sense that they obfuscate the historical truth, can play a progressive role. My big example, you remember Tiananmen demonstrations where the Chinese people, they built up a kind of naive, primitive, from paper and so on, Statue of Liberty. But we should ask the question, what did this statue effectively represent for them? I think it wasn't American imperialism. It was wrongly attributed to this statue, but it was nonetheless a dream of more free, open society, and so on and so on. So this is the problem for me with woke critics. Yes, we should totally unmask history. My favorite target here is none other than Washington. Many people don't know that Washington was the richest man, George Washington, the founding father, in the United States at that point. And that rich people were much more anti-British than poor poor English people. So we have to demystify all this. Nonetheless, whenever somebody says freedom, democracy, human rights, my point is, let's look and see how does this slogan function in a certain situation, political. What does it mean when people evoke that slogan? For example, again, my own example, when people were demanding freedom, democracy, blah, blah, at the end of the 80s, the end of really existing socialism. No, at least for Slovenia, I can guarantee you, the ideal was almost a more open socialism. We wanted, of course, freedom of the press, political freedom, but also more social justice, better health care, and so on and so on. No. So again, always look at what slogans, which may be originally imposed by the West, what they actually mean in certain situations. Of course, freedom and democracy are always, almost as a rule, used to install new authoritarian pro-Western regimes. So I would say concrete analysis.
Bringing woke culture back to a more modern application when it comes to gender definitions and so on, often people are scared to step in any direction because the wrong statement can be used as a weapon against them. We see politicians walking on eggshells when it comes to saying anything, and it kind of twists what people can discuss, how openly they can talk. So has that idea of free speech disappeared because of the potential landmines that exist with issues such as woke culture?
Yes, but again, these landmines, I think, should be closely analyzed, and we should be critical towards both sides. Very briefly, to give you my position, I am against binary sexuality, all that stuff. What I reject in trans culture is the idea that gender identity is not biologically determined. Okay, I buy this, but it's simply what you feel. You experience yourself as being, I don't know what, masculine, feminine, trans, whatever. And this is what you are. My God, did we forget about Freud and psychoanalysis? I think that building gender identity, it's a very complex problem, full of contradictions, full of tensions, very traumatic problem. So what I oppose is this joyful vision of trans. Oh, I'm free, I'm not determined by biology, I can choose this, I can choose that. Yes, you are not totally determined by biology, but it's choosing what you are is an unconscious process, a very traumatic one. I know many trans people. Most of them suffer, not so much because of external pressure as because of their own inner turmoil. So what bothers me is not the goals of trans ideology. The goals, I fully agree with them. I even fully, again, agree with the premise that gender identity is not a biological fact. I'm just saying it's not a simple choice. I am not what I feel that I am. Feelings can also cheat.
Actually, immigration is something perhaps that is a key concern in many countries across the world. How do you regard the way immigration is being presented, is being handled? We're hearing some terrible comments, obviously, by some of the candidates about how they regard immigrants. What's your take on that?
First, I would say that I know the situation in Europe. Again, my position is against both extremes. I don't agree with this easy liberal left position, just open up the borders and so on. No, first, if you open up the borders, the populist anti-immigrant right will win. What will you do then? Macron already did something incredible. I support him. How did he prevent Le Pen from taking over? By practically, at least partially, cancelling democracy. the specificity of French constitution imposed by de Gaulle in early 60s is that the president can nominate the government and the government can be operative even without being confirmed in Assemblée Nationale, in the parliament. So it was a manipulation, but it worked. France is not in chaos and so on. So the first thing I would say is, don't focus just on this, open the border, yes, not. Ask yourself, why these waves of immigration? And there are two reasons which are not often mentioned. The first one is that, let's be frank, without American intervention in Iraq or Western intervention in Libya or the mess in Syria, where Russia and the West intervened, there would have been no ISIS, there would have been much less immigration. I think the solution is to rethink the entire economic political relationship. Now people tell me we don't have time to do this. Yes, we have to begin now. Second thing, more important, that what right-wingers don't want to hear. I know pretty well the situation all around Europe. Do you know that, let's say that somehow, whoever who is now more right-wing, Swedish government, Meloni in Italy, and so on, let's say that they succeed throwing out most of the immigrants. It's immediate collapse of economy, because all the so-called lower-paid physical jobs, construction, waste disposal, and so on, not to mention, maybe even more crucial, these, how do you call them, homes for old people in hospitals, caretaking, and so on. These posts are already occupied by immigrants. A friend of mine in Sweden has a mother who is now in a home for old people. And he told me that mother told him that of all the personnel there is only one white woman, and she is Polish even, not Swedish. So it's the type of capitalism that we have in Western Europe, and probably also in the United States. We know the role of Mexican illegal workers in doing harvest in California and so on. So capitalism, the way we have it now, needs immigrants. It would be a catastrophe to throw them, to be too tough, to throw them out.
So
That's the crucial.
It sounds, Professor, that the idea of replacement theory then with immigrants is not so easy to define.
No, because there is also another reason. Because most of the immigrants are nonetheless younger people. In Sweden, I read a wonderful analysis of how is it that their healthcare system doesn't go bankrupt, although Sweden has also lower natality and a higher level of retired people, so that now it's, I think, 1 to 3, 1 to 4. For one retired people, or a little bit more than one actively working person is needed financially. So, but you know what's the paradox? In spite of all the complaints, that without the contribution, because if they work, they also pay for healthcare, without the financial contribution of the immigrants in Sweden, their entire healthcare system would already break down. So again, my first point is avoid this quick sophistry, replacement, throw them out, or blah, blah. I mean, on the other hand, we should say it's legitimate to ask who is coming to the West. I think it should be more organized. I understand that some people worry that precisely because it's not more organized, smugglers of people control the trade, so there is a lot of criminal there. But my point is that if you look at it closely, it's not the really poor people who come to the West. Because at least from the Middle East, you have to pay a couple of thousands of euros and so on, so that the really poor people remain there. In other words, that's my argument for what I still ironically call communism. More global coordination. Without this, we are lost.
Professor Zizek, one reason people love you very much and you have a large following globally is because you are not worried about provoking, and you've certainly provoked thought. And I wonder, having reached the age of 75, have you mellowed in your thoughts at all? Have you revisited some of your philosophical positions with the wisdom of those years?
Now, first I must tell you that being 75, I can tell you something very sad. There is nothing wise about being old. It's just you're losing your abilities. It's sad. Second thing, no! I am not getting softer. If anything, I'm getting more radical. But maybe softer at another level. Do you know? I find this a wonderful self-definition. It was proposed to me by Tyler Cowen, who is more a right liberal, and I accepted it. You know how I define myself? Moderately conservative communist. I'm a communist in the sense, not the old Central Committee party, but we need more global cooperation. Imagine new crisis and there will be, like a COVID and so on. We can only confront with strong global cooperation, ecological and other threats. But how we do it, we should be, here comes the moderate conservative aspect. We should be very careful, because if history teaches us anything, it is that how many well-meant radical measures then entailed catastrophic side effects. This is why also I think our liberal political system needs restructuring. I don't know how, but listen, I spoke with a Chinese guy. I nonetheless, although I'm very critical of China, respect what China achieved. And they told me, listen, the world today needs not communist planning, but thinking in the terms what will be in next 30, 50 years. In China, they can do it because, they don't worry, will they be elected, re-elected in 2 or 4 years? While in the West, the whole political system is pressing you into thinking in short-term terms. So
Professor,
I think...
I was going to say we have so many questions. Yes. I do want to end, though, with a thought. You're known for your sense of humor. What's your favorite philosophical joke?
Okay, I like philosophical jokes which are at the same time vulgar, but I will put an innocent joke.
Please.
Which I think is known, I repeat it all the times. It's not even a joke, it's an anecdote. It's a scene from Ernst Lubitsch's film Ninochka, where a guy goes to a cafeteria, this is a joke told in the film, and says, "Can I get coffee but without cream, please?" And the waiter answers, "Sorry, sir, we don't have cream, so I cannot give it to you a coffee without cream, but we have milk, so I can only give to you a coffee without milk." That's dialectics, that what is missing also counts. Coffee is materially the same coffee, but coffee without milk, it's nonetheless symbolically in how you taste it, not the same as coffee without cream.
I think
always ask, this is my lesson, when you see a certain thing, ask yourself what this thing is not, but it could have been.
Professor,
you should count in this.
We have to wrap up there. I think I've been to that coffee shop. Thank you so much. So many questions. Hope to speak to you again.
Whenever you want, I'm always for you. You are one of the few hopes, because it's so sad to see how journalists who... But it's not even a question, I agree here. You are not a crazy provocateur. You are just honest, moderate guy.
Thank you.
How we are under oppression
Coming
today.
from you, that's
Thank you
precious.
very much. Always for you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
If you ever have the opportunity to hold a manuscript, it will captivate you and take you to other worlds. As soon as your eyes fall upon its front page, you will stand amazed as you behold the style and method of writing present on it. Everything here is subject to rules, and writing does not stray far from this. Even the title and the basmala adhere to these rules, as well as the introduction, sections, chapters, and finally reaching the conclusion. The rigor of the curriculum is certain, as is good writing. The manuscript is divided according to its physical components, which are paper, midad, scripts, and binding. The content of the manuscript is another story. The research method is the basis of this content. After reviewing thousands of manuscripts and studying them attentively and carefully, it was found that most of them follow a similar methodological approach. The approach includes research methodology, classification, and authorship. It is a methodology that has been prevalent since the early beginnings of writing and is still present today. After the allure of the manuscript's exterior wears off, you open the cover, and your eyes will fall upon the first page, and you'll notice that it's most likely a piece of white paper. From here, you realize the first rule in the essentials of writing among the Arabs in the early Islamic era, which is to leave the first page of the manuscript blank. Nothing is written on this page, for fear of it being tampered with or contaminated due to frequent use, or perhaps some of the lines of writing become blurry. It was also placed for binding purposes, or to have plant-like decorations on it, or drawings. It is rare for manuscripts to have a specific page designated for the title. Many manuscripts have had the title page left blank. The copyists would add the title of the book and the author's name to it later on. The owner or the reader of the book may also do so. This explains the difference between the scripts and fonts that are found in the title and the manuscript itself. It is possible to make a mistake when placing the title of the book, or when attributing the book to an author. It is possible to sometimes find a preface or a prologue on the title page, or the ownership deed that includes the legal purchase details as well as the price paid for the manuscript by the buyer. On this page, you can also find the names of the witnesses who were mentioned, and many other things that have nothing to do with the author or the copyist. The introduction to the manuscript would not be without the basmala. Unless the first page or several pages of the manuscripts were missing. Some manuscripts that were written by non-Muslims would begin with the basmala, abiding by and honoring the Quran, and following the Quran's style and approach. They also praise the Messenger of Allah, peace be upon him, his people, and followers until the day of judgment, along with some prayers. When you browse through the pages of the manuscript, you will notice many writings that are found in the margins. These writings are called footnotes. After the scholars read a certain manuscript, they would write many footnotes as observations or comments. Even some of them, if collected and organized, could become a standalone book in their own right. After the doxology, the author would state, "And now." Then they would mention their name, the topic they desire to research, and the reasons that prompted them to do so. The scholar should mention their methodology and divide the manuscript into sections and chapters, among other matters that the author deems necessary. In the introduction, there is a lot of important information, such as the title of the manuscript, for example. The scholar may mention the title of another one of their works, which leads us to further know the author, if they were not already mentioned on the title page or in the introduction. The scientist may explain the subject they are researching and define its parameters. They would cite sources and references that they derived the material of their book from. The author would mention the name of their sheikhs and teachers, who they were taught by, or whose material that they had read. In the introduction, they would sometimes list the name of some of their students. When reading the introduction, we can discern what the copyist added to the manuscript. We can also find evidence or references to the date of when the manuscript was composed or classified. A summary of the material that the manuscript elaborates upon can be sometimes found. The manuscript's conclusion is no less important than its introduction or its content. It includes the information that it contained that was not found anywhere else in the manuscript, such as the title of the manuscript or the author's name, regardless of whether the author themselves mentioned it or the copyist did so. Some manuscripts may contain a phrase that indicates the completion of the text, such as, "The book is completed." In addition to the date of its completion and the sources on which the author relied on while categorizing their book. A historical event is mentioned in the conclusion, in which the copyist or author dates this copy of the manuscript. They can also include the title of another book by the author. The copyist has a way of writing the final sentences of the manuscript. They would usually be written as an upside-down triangle, with its base directed towards the top, and the top of the triangle would be at the bottom, and it was referred to as al-harda. Manuscripts have persevered and traversed through time to our current days. They were preserved and transmitted developments in the ways of writing and authorship among the Arabs. The content of their books form threads of light that still shine and glimmer to this day.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
My campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs, as Middle Eastern, we're too emotional.
Join me on the Riz Khan Show for empowering conversation.
At Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday right here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson, coming up on today's programme. In a reversal of policy, Ukraine is given the go-ahead to strike Russia using US-made missiles. That's raising concerns about further escalation. President-elect Donald Trump has been accused of selecting so-called disruptors to lead his incoming cabinet. His son, Donald Trump Jr., is quick to defend him, saying, "We know who the good guys and the bad guys are." And a World Bank report estimates that damage inflicted on Lebanon carries a cost of at least $8.5 billion so far, even as diplomatic efforts continue for a ceasefire. Hello and welcome to the programme. The Kremlin says that any US decision to allow Ukraine to fire American missiles deep into Russia would mean it was directly involved in the conflict. While responding to Biden's latest decision, Moscow has accused the administration of escalating the ongoing conflict. While Russian officials have issued repeated warnings claiming that the West is, quote, playing with fire by testing the boundaries of what a nuclear power like Russia is willing to tolerate. This is what the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov had to say.
If such a decision has been made and conveyed to the Kyiv regime, then this means a qualitatively new round of the escalation of tension. This is also a qualitatively new situation from the standpoint of US involvement in this conflict.
Well, for more on this, I'm joined now by Boris Volodarsky, who's an intelligence historian and former captain in Russia's special forces, the GRU Spetsnaz. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Warnings have been issued by Moscow. We've had one Russian senator by the name of Vladimir Jabarov calling this an unprecedented step towards World War III. Are we really on the brink of World War III, do you think?
I don't think so. And speaking about Jabarov, I guess he's the former general of the KGB, of the FSB, and particularly of its economic department, heavily involved in corruption, as far as I remember. So whatever he says is absolutely relevant.
But do you think Mr. Putin might be considering options, including a nuclear option, hence all this discussion about World War III, which, by the way, isn't just coming from Moscow. We've also been hearing it from various places in Washington as well.
I don't think Putin is interested in considering any nuclear options, because whatever they say, I guess everyone should ignore, especially in the West. It's their way trying to stop the West's involvement in the Ukrainian war. And they have succeeded that in the past 1,000 days, almost 1,000 days, in the past 3 years. And the escalation of the war came from the Russian side, as they're heavily bombing Ukrainian cities using all kinds of missiles, drones, and all that sort of things to completely destroy Ukraine. So any talk about Western involvement is just senseless, and it's empty talk.
But we've been hearing Moscow saying words to the effect that NATO is pretty much now directly in conflict, in confrontation with Russia. Is that really how you see things right now?
Well, the West is not sufficiently in confrontation with Russia, to my opinion, because that should have happened in February 2022, when Russia attacked Ukraine exactly as Hitler did with Russia in 1941.
And the West was absolutely silent since that time. And all supplies to Ukraine were more or less to carry on the conflict and not to end it. Because if the United States spent more money and helped Ukraine more and gave allowance to use missiles supplied by the US against Russia, the conflict would probably end long before. And we won't have so many victims on the Ukrainian and even on the Russian side as well.
But we're hearing as well, for example, Dmitry Peskov saying that the United States is pouring fuel on the fire. I mean, clearly they're extremely angry by this decision to allow Ukraine to use this type of weaponry against Russia. I mean, how much of a game changer do you think this decision could end up being?
I don't think there's going to be any game change at all. They were drawing their red lines earlier. They've been doing it all the time, and every time there's a new step on behalf of America, of the United States. It's just no reaction at all. So I think whatever Peskov is saying, one should ignore completely.
Okay, so you're not concerned about any further escalation as a result of this decision by the United States and I should add, the outgoing President Joe Biden?
Absolutely not. I am just only thinking about escalation coming from the Russian side, which is absolutely intolerable and should be stopped as quick as possible.
Do you think there may be some thinking on the part of the Biden administration that this is a way of giving Ukraine a little bit more leverage ahead of what look like fairly inevitable negotiations or peace talks at a later date?
I think that should have happened a long time ago. I don't think today that's going to give a lot of advantages to Ukraine, although that will help in a way. But as far as I know, we're talking about the distance, the ATACMS distance of about 190 miles, which is definitely not enough. There should be far, far longer distance, and there should be far better weapons supplied, and it should have been done before, not today, because they did the Biden administration. They were preferring all the time the appeasement theory, and they were just trying to play a game with Putin, and Putin is not a person to play games with.
Why do you say that? Because he's unpredictable, or he may retaliate in an unexpected way? What's the thinking?
He's perfectly predictable, and we know his aims. It is exactly like what happened in the 30s and the 40s with Hitler, who produced his Mein Kampf book, where he wrote exactly what he was going to do. And with Putin, he announced many times what he was going to do, to destroy Ukraine completely, to make it part of Russia, and then start doing the same with the rest of the former Warsaw Pact countries. That is, to come to Germany, take East Germany, to conquer Poland, Baltic republics, Moldavia, and all the rest. His plans are laid out very clearly, and we know what they want. And when somebody is talking about peaceful talks, I'm really all the time surprised, because the peaceful talks are the total elimination of Ukraine and with the NATO, return to the situation of 1991.
Aren't the negotiated settlements more focused on the idea that perhaps Ukraine will have to make some concessions? But I mean, are people really saying that Ukraine would cease to exist as a result of a negotiated settlement here?
Well, Ukraine will not cease to exist as a result of any activity of the United States or other countries. They will start guerrilla war, quite definitely. But they will fight for their independence, and at the end they will win. It's happened always in history.
Donald Trump will be the US president in just over 2 months from now. How do you rate his chances of ending this conflict? And do you think he has something new to bring to the table?
I don't think he has any chance at all to end this conflict. And Russia will definitely not listen to what he's going to say. And at one moment when he starts pressing, and he will probably do it for his electorate, because one of his principal moments in his election campaign was that he was going to end the conflict in Ukraine in 3 days, or he said, or 24 hours, or whatever he said. That was all just empty talk. And of course, Russia will not listen to him. And at one moment, if he tries to push harder, which I don't think he would go to do, they will just tell him buzz off, and that will be all.
A lot is being reported about North Korean involvement in this conflict in Ukraine now. I just want to get your thoughts on that. And do you think it's fair to say that by Russian logic, if the United States is in direct confrontation with Russia now, by virtue of its assistance to Ukraine, is North Korea, therefore, in direct confrontation with NATO?
North Korea has always been in direct confrontation with NATO, and Kim was always threatening the world, and specifically the United States, with the nuclear attack. And all talks that Trump previously, in his previous terms, wanted to do with North Korea ended in complete failure. And of course, Kim was not going to listen to what Trump is saying. For him, contacts and collaboration with Russia is, of course, to a great advantage because his nuclear arsenal will be hugely improved by Russian technologies. And he must send 100,000 people or more because for him, it doesn't matter how many of his soldiers die in this war. Whatever matters for him is his own situation, his own position, and the better arms of his country. So whatever they are saying about escalation, confrontation, that really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because Russia is doing what they want, irrespective of what the world is thinking. They left all agreements, they signed during the past 30 or 40 or 50 years, and they are just not caring about what the world is saying. So why should the Western world care about what the Russians are saying today?
Just lastly, I mean, do you think it's fair to say that the fact that North Korea's help is being enlisted here is a sign of desperation on the part of Moscow, manpower and weaponry said to be in short supply? Do you think that's the reason why they've got the North Koreans involved?
That's one of the reasons. The second reason, the second action of them is to work with Iran. So they got supplies from Iran, they get supplies from North Korea. Their military situation is very bad. As far as I have heard, they're using very obsolete weapons very often. They have tanks in the field, and they were found many times by Ukrainian reporters, by Western reporters. They're using wartime, Second World War time tanks and all that other weaponry. So they're running out of weapons. They have no technology to improve them. They have not enough money, possibilities to produce more arms. So they're taking from whenever they can. This is one of the reasons why they apply to North Korea.
Okay, well, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Boris Volodarsky, really appreciate your time. Now, November the 19th marks a grim milestone, 1,000 days since the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war. Well, the conflict began with Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine back in February 2022. And now, as the war enters its third year, Kyiv's forces are facing intensifying pressure. Well, on the streets of central Kyiv, locals say that Biden's latest decision that allows the use of American missiles to strike against targets in Russia could provide a much-needed boost. However, some feel the move has come too late.
To say that this is very timely wouldn't be true, but perhaps it is a preventative action against Trump. Biden has less than 2 months left, and he's trying to do all he can to leave a good legacy. This is good. I guess that it will help us in the future, but I don't think that this will be solved by weapons alone. It may mean additional points for him from his American voters, but for Ukrainians, this is a little too late.
We must defend ourselves. They are striking us while we cannot. It is horrible and it is strange. His permission is just words. Let's see what it means in reality. We have not seen any missile flying deep into Russia. Once we see it, then it will mean that he gave us permission. For now, it's just words.
Well, Well, let's get some more analysis now, and we can speak to Solomia Bobrovska, Ukrainian MP, who joins us now from Kyiv. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We're hearing about this decision by the Biden administration to allow Kyiv to use that US weaponry inside Russia. A lot of anger, some reaction even from Washington. Talk of World War III. What do you make of this talk of a major escalation?
You know, yesterday when we heard this news, and President Zelensky even couldn't confirm in his evening daily speech to Ukrainians that he cannot confirm that we have the permission. That's the first of all, and the second one, that's about the permission to use the ATACMS only for Kursk direction, and that's, you know, it sounds very cruelty or jeer, you know, to Ukrainians, because you see how the people are just dying, and especially after the last couple very intensive and horrible missile attack on Ukraine. And just the day before yesterday, we had 120 missiles plus 90 Shahed drones attack. It was combined attack on Ukraine after, by the way, when Scholz called to Putin. And it sounds really weird and very, very politically masked, I would say. That's Biden's news. And I don't want to hear just the words. We want to see ATACMS working on at least somewhere. But the problem is whether how many missiles we'll get the first time, the second one, the distance of these missiles on which we can use that, and the third one, that's Storm Shadow, British Storm Shadow permission, and Scalp from French and Taurus from German. So it sounds like it's saying yes, but in reality, no.
Do you think that explains the reaction from your president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who, to quote him, said, the missiles will speak for themselves, strikes are not carried out with words? I mean, that doesn't sound very enthusiastic, does it? And do you think that he thinks this is perhaps too much of a hollow promise?
Yes, that's why I'm trying to explain that within Ukrainian society and even with Ukrainian members of parliament, we do not understand till the end whether we got this permission for ATACMS or not, whether it will work or not, or it will work only for months and then after Trump's inauguration it will stop. Because we see the reaction of some Republicans now in Congress, and whether it will be working only, we can use the ATACMS only on Kursk direction because of the Northern Korean troops, or we can use it widely on the whole front line. That's why Zelensky said as he said, and that's why even we don't understand. So it's a political part of American political game. It's a political some political message for Ukrainians, or if this formula actually can work at all, we still do not understand. That's why he said we will see when ATACMS will work, but not on the words. In the news, when the White House didn't have this for the last night, the real message to Ukraine. In an official news. Only today in the morning in Ukraine, according to Kyiv time, we heard, so we can use it on Kursk direction because of the North Korean troops. But again, so many questions are and appears, and at the same time, we don't see the position of UK, France, and Germany as well.
Okay, so it sounds like Ukraine is feeling somewhat abandoned at this moment by its allies. Just going back to the reaction, though, from not just the Russians who are saying this is an unprecedented step towards World War III. Donald Trump's own son said that he believes that President Biden's trying to lead the United States towards World War III before his father takes office. What do you make of the fact that this talk of World War III is being used not just by Moscow, but by the incoming administration, well, someone related to the incoming administration in the United States as well?
You know, to be honest, we're sick and tired of these words. And yesterday, Ukrainians, by the way, after this combined huge attack, as we treat this all with humor now, all this serious political statements. Some of my colleagues made the postcard. Today is a day of escalation with the kitten, you know, and flowers. That's how to mark the escalation day when according to the Biden's logic, we can use the ATACMS, or according to our partner's allies' logic, we can use ATACMS and finally to resist Russians. We've heard this statements about the escalation and World War III since 24th of February. Don't resist, because it will start the Third World War. We will not give you tanks because it will be the beginning of escalation, and Russia will move to Baltics and Poland. We will not give you F-16, the oldest version of the fly jets, because Russians will treat this escalation. We will not say yes to NATO, because Russia will be angry, and so on. That's an endless story of different points, and issues, and that's an endless list, it seems to me, for Ukraine. When we have to hear from the partners, it will be the escalation day, the World War III, and so on, so on. What are the arguments except their emotions, or what are the arguments except their not willingness to finally to help and support Ukraine until the victory, but not as they like to say, we want Ukraine to win, but not Russia not to lose. That's the whole problem in the very basic things. Not Russia to lose, but it's impossible with Ukrainian victory if they really want Ukraine to win.
I mean, it sounds like you think a lot of mistakes have been made along the way, strategic errors on the part of Ukraine's allies. But let's just focus on how things unfold from here. 65 days or so left of the Biden administration, a new president coming into the White House. I'm just wondering what you think that's going to change, and whether you think Donald Trump will and can end this war.
I'm afraid he can make lots of mistakes, and it can be negotiations or freezing the war in very sharp methods, sharp and rapid methods. But the only thing they have to understand that there is Trump, there is Zelensky, there is Putin, Putin who doesn't want so far to listen to anyone because he is in a very successful position and he's doing success on the front and in Ukraine as well. If we are looking up to the front map. That's the first point. The second one, there is Ukrainian society, which will say its final word, yes or no, because that's about Ukrainians who stand 3 days, then a week, and then 1,000 day resisting Russia. And sometimes it's impossible to press on Ukrainians because it's just impossible. We are to decide what we're gonna do. We'll freeze or we'll start negotiating or whatever. But that's the very dangerous bell, ringing a bell for Europe, that if Trump will say no to Ukraine, no to NATO as the whole security system, someone from the European leaders has to take leadership to take care of security and defense in Europe. If US will start their independent politics on this issue.
But do you think Europe can fill the void if the United States says over to Europe, it's not our problem? Can Europe fill that void left behind by the United States?
I would say it could be very unpredictable. There are dozens of plans, ABC, which Europe has to count with the Trump administration. And why not? We hear his statements. And Europe actually hears what is he doing and saying. So I think they have to be ready with all plans on the table to be prepared for. And that's what we tried always to explain for Europeans. We want time for your building military productions and capacities. And that's if you are not capable to produce as much as Russia is doing now for this 2.5 years, when Russia increased their production in missiles, ballistic missiles, rockets, Shaheds, and so on. And Europe, just with the US even with together, they're just increasing and still not on the same line. I think that's the huge problem, not only for Ukraine, that's our war, but for European security as well. And unfortunately, it's not even the bell from Russia, it's the choir with the bells from Russia. And now it's only the bell from the US side for now.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you so much for speaking to us. Sonia Bobrovska, Ukrainian MP. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Well, the first Ukrainian strikes could happen in the coming days and are likely to be carried out using ATACMS rockets, which have a range of more than 300 kilometers or 190 miles. Well, in the European Union, Annalena Baerbock, Germany's foreign minister, has said that Biden's U-turn was important, and she cautioned that it should not be seen as a rethink of the Western efforts. Instead, quote, as an intensification of what has already been delivered. Well, for more, we're joined now by William Alberg, who is former director of NATO Arms Control, Disarmament and Weapons of Mass Destruction Non-Proliferation Centre. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. What do you think is the significance of this announcement by the United States, and how much of a difference do you think this is all going to make?
I think it's a very significant development, both politically, just because it shows that the United States is going to lead the way in allowing Ukraine to take the fight more onto Russian territory. But militarily, this is very significant because, as you mentioned, the ATACMS artillery system, these are rockets that can go much further into Russian territory. So essentially what Russia has done by, with the West banning Ukraine from being able to use these on Russian territory, Russia has been able to concentrate forces, logistics, command centers, artillery depots, etc., on Russian territory. Now these sites will be vulnerable to Ukrainian artillery strikes, which again means Russia's going to have to rethink where it's storing these. It had been safe on Russian territory. Now nowhere on Russian territory within 300 miles or 300 kilometers of the border is going to be safe.
So how do you think these weapons could be used, and specifically on what sorts of targets?
These are very highly accurate rockets that are fired from the HIMARS system. And so these systems are mobile. They can set up very quickly. They can fire very accurately deep into Russian territory. So the primary targets are going to be Russian command centers, Russian depots for fuel and ammunition. And so what this is going to do is it's going to disrupt Russia's ability to command its forces near Ukrainian territory, and it's going to force Russia to push its logistics and command centers back even further away from the battlefield. And we know from the way Russia fights, they need to have their commanders and their logistics very close to the front line in order to be able to function effectively. So this may disrupt Russia's ability to do things more dynamically. It may slow them down a lot. It may slow down their thinking and their movements considerably.
And with those who are concerned about escalation, I mean, do you think this is a case of the West baiting Russia and therefore putting lives at risk and possibly even putting the specter of nuclear warfare on the table?
I don't think so. I think rather it's the other way around, that Russia has continually tried to use non-credible threats in order to try to inhibit the West from doing what it needs to do to support Ukraine. So throughout the conflict, first it was we couldn't give Ukraine mobile artillery. Then it was we couldn't give them battle tanks. Then it was we couldn't give them aircraft. We couldn't give them HIMARS. Every one of these was said by Russia to be an escalation that would change the nature of the conflict. Every time we've crossed Russia's red lines, nothing has really changed. So I think this is another case of Russia trying to induce fear in the West to prevent the West from doing what Ukraine really needs them to do. And I think that what we'll find is that the nature of the conflict won't change. There's really, I don't think, any credible threat of Russia going further. Attacking the West, for instance, would be suicide. And using nuclear weapons in this conflict is simply not politically or militarily viable for Russia.
So with regards to this idea that this move brings NATO into direct confrontation with Russia, it doesn't sound like you think this has been a massive game changer. Was NATO already in direct confrontation with Russia, therefore, do you think?
I think Russia has been in direct confrontation with NATO for years, and it's the West's lack of willingness to recognize that Russia has been trying to undermine the West, trying to infiltrate, commit sabotage, use chemical weapons in Britain. I mean, Russia has been doing all kinds of incredibly aggressive things against the West for more than a decade. And I think that realization is coming more to the play here. The fact that weapons supplied by NATO countries are going to be used more effectively in Ukraine's fight against Russia is really no change to me. It's just, again, a realization that Ukraine needs to be able to defend itself. We're supplying them with the means to do so, and now we're supplying them with the ability to use them the way that Ukraine believes they need to in order to win this conflict.
But there are just so many people who think that the West has gone too far this time. We've just had the Hungarian foreign minister warning that this war in Ukraine now risks spilling over into a global conflict. that warning came just in the last couple of hours. I mean, it doesn't sound like you agree with what they're saying. It doesn't sound like you think anything particular has changed as a result of developments in the last 24 hours then.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think there is no real change here. And I think once Ukraine starts to use them, I think Russia will complain a little bit more. But I mean, just yesterday, Russia unleashed an attack on Ukraine's energy infrastructure in order to try to freeze its Ukrainian public citizens, to try to deprive them of warmth as they go into the winter. This is a massive escalation and an effort to bring direct suffering to Ukrainian civilians. Had nothing to do with this decision. This is just Russian policy. So what are they going to do that's worse than what they're already doing? They're already targeting civilians. They're already trying to starve Ukraine's population, to freeze them in winter. It beggars belief when people say this is provoking Russia. Russia is in the middle of trying to slaughter Ukrainian civilians. This is not a just war. This is not a rational conflict. And Ukraine needs everything that they can to defend themselves. And I think it's absolutely foolish to say that this is going to push Russia into doing something as crazy as attacking NATO. It simply won't, because it knows that if it did so, it would lose. It's not going to do that. So much respect to the Hungarian minister. I think I don't think he's being entirely truthful here. I think there's something else behind what he's saying, which has very little to do with Ukraine and its willingness to defend itself.
But it isn't just him. As I said, there are other voices, and we've had Donald Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., and a Russian MP, in fact, using the language of the Third World War. This is what Donald Trump Jr. said. They seem to want World War III before my father has a chance to create peace and save lives. So it's not just coming from the Hungarian foreign minister. I mean, it sounds like everyone is deeply concerned.
Sure. And I mean, to be cautious about escalation is one thing. But again, as I've mentioned, throughout this conflict, Russia has said that they would escalate if we were to supply them with different types of weapons. And we've crossed these red lines and nothing has changed. The fact that a Russian MP says this, well, of course, if you watch the Russian news, and if you've watched them for the past 3 or 4 years, they've been talking about how everything is an escalation and how they should launch nuclear strikes against the United Kingdom, how they need to eradicate the West, how they need to demonstrate nuclear weapons use against the West in order to make us fearful of Russia again. This is part of a much larger Russian narrative where Russia wants to use coercive threats in order to get what it wants. And the fact that it resonates with some people in the West is sad, because when a bully threatens you, you have to stand up to that bully. If you just keep giving in to the bully is going to continue to take more and more and more. And so, with all due respect to everyone who has said that this is an escalation or the brink of World War III, it isn't. It's not. It's not going to cause World War III. We'll see what Trump does. We'll see if Trump can bring peace. And I would welcome if he could bring a just peace for Ukraine in this conflict. But the fact that people are willing to say that this is an escalation does not mean that it actually is.
Yeah, you anticipated my next question, because I wanted to ask you a bit about the incoming Trump administration. And I want to ask you whether you think that NATO is perhaps feeling a little bit vulnerable at the prospect of another Trump presidency.
It's an interesting question, and honestly, the answer is I don't think anyone really knows. There have been statements from people in Trump's orbit that he doesn't like NATO very much. At the same time, when you look at how much the NATO allies were spending on defense in, say, 2014, I think there were 4 allies who were spending 2%, and now there are 23. And so I think Trump himself can take credit for strengthening NATO. And, so he could declare victory and say that NATO has changed because of Trump's policies, and therefore he owns it and that he's very happy about that. But the opposite could happen as well. We simply don't know. And as he brings together his team, some of his team have been very supportive of NATO, some have been very critical of NATO. His choice for the Secretary of Defense is somewhere in between, but has not been an opponent to NATO. So we really have to see how the team completely fills out, whether they're going to get through Senate for approval, and then what policies they try to enact. But so far, I'm cautiously optimistic that Trump, again, could take credit for strengthening NATO during his time as president.
And when it comes to ending this particular conflict with Ukraine, obviously he's got a different dynamic to his relationship with President Putin, to the relationship that President Biden has. Do you think he's got what it takes to end this conflict, de-escalate this conflict, and what do you think his approach is going to be?
It'll be really interesting. I mean, every president comes into the White House and says that they're going to resolve our issues with Russia, whether it was Clinton or Bush or Obama or Trump. And at the end of their terms, we still end up in conflict with Russia, because I think the conflict between the United States and Russia is much deeper than personality. In general, I think Trump got along a little bit better with Putin than some presidents have, but fundamentally our interests differ. And I think that will continue no matter what. I think there is more space for Trump to have negotiations with Putin. In general, Republican administrations tend to be more deal-making with our adversaries. So we'll see what's possible. And they do have this long-standing relationship between the two of them. They have talked many times. So I think if you're looking for a stabilization in the US-Russia relationship, I think Trump is probably a pretty good chance of that. But again, we'll see exactly who ends up on his final team and where his priorities lie as well. He may be focused entirely on domestic politics, and he may just want placeholders for international relations, or he may want a big deal with the New START treaty, for instance, lapsing in February 2026. It may be that Trump wants to replace Obama's New START agreement with his own treaty with Russia. So we could see some sort of grand bargain on nuclear weapons. We really don't know. Again, we'll have to see what his priorities are once he gets his team in place and once he starts laying out what he wants to take care of first.
Yeah, and the NATO chief, Mark Rutte, is saying that this conflict in Ukraine isn't just a threat to Ukraine, it's also a threat to US interests. And I'd like to ask you what you think he means by that, and whether you think the Trump administration views it in the same way.
Well, I think what the Secretary General means is that Russia is trying to hit the West where they're weakest and trying to divide us and trying to undermine our confidence and our ability to represent our interests. And so if Ukraine is defeated or seen to be defeated, I think Putin will turn his eye towards the next weakest spots in Europe, in Asia, in Africa. We have to remember that Russia right now is not only invading Ukraine, it is also waging a campaign in Africa to try to bolster different governments there and try to secure long-term resources. He's trying to push the United States out of the Middle East. Russia's longer-term efforts across the world appears to be to create its own coalition against what Russia calls the Anglo-Saxon bloc of countries. If you read their foreign policy, it's very anti-America. It's very anti-Anglo-Saxon, as they put it in their own foreign policy documents. So I think Rutte is correct. Russia has laid out its stall as having a desire to lead an anti-American bloc. And so Ukraine is merely the first step in a much larger plan that Putin has in order to try to represent Russian interests and to push America into a smaller position. So we'll see if the dynamic between Trump and Putin changes that fundamentally, and if Russia changes their foreign policy direction to be more cooperative with the West. We just don't know. But I think Rutte is right saying that Putin so far has set out his stall as an anti-American center of power in the world.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for your time today. William Albrecht.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, President-elect Donald Trump's campaign picks are continuing to send shockwaves through Washington. His choice for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is denying a sexual assault allegation, while his possible Attorney General pick, Matt Gaetz, is at the center of an ethics scandal, leading some to describe his nominations as disruptors. Well, the controversy doesn't end there. Trump has also nominated Chris Wright as Energy Secretary. That's a climate skeptic who denies the existence of a climate crisis. Well, for more on this, we're joined now by lawyer and Republican strategist Amanda Mackey. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. You were recently a volunteer for the election integrity campaign for President-elect Donald Trump. I just want to ask you, first of all, what you make of how Team Trump is shaping up.
Well, I think what we're seeing, it's not a surprise. These are a lot of Trump loyalists, people who have supported President Trump when others in the Republican Party weren't supporting him. These are people who, for the last year and a half to 2 years, have been front and center on our TV screens, defending President Trump and defending his positions. So as it goes in every administration, you reward people who, have been loyal, who have worked hard for you. And certainly that's what we're seeing. But, if you look back to where President Trump was in 2017 when he first came in, he brought in a lot of people who he didn't know. I mean, he certainly didn't know Washington. He was a political outsider. And a lot of those people, he believes, turned on him. And so being skeptical about that, he's going to go for people who he knows are loyal and have proven that. And I think that's what you're seeing with these picks for his cabinet positions.
And what do you make of this label, disruptors? Do you think it's the correct sort of label?
I do. Disruptors, in government terms, and I worked in government for a long time. I started my career as a native Farsi speaker. I worked in the Pentagon just weeks after 9/11. And from there, I went on to work in Congress for a decade as a lawyer. And, having been in and around Washington, I actually grew up there. It's hard to find people who are willing to go against the grain. Certainly, we've never seen that with other presidents where they say, well, I'm going to come in and I'm going to disrupt the apple cart, if you will. And Donald Trump campaigned on that. He campaigned on that before. But now I think even more so, a lot of people say he has a mandate. He's going to go there and shake the trees. And I think you're going to actually see that. I mean, honestly, I think what's emblematic of that and personified in that is Matt Gaetz, Congressman Matt Gaetz, former congressman from Florida, who, doesn't back away, isn't afraid of a camera, and certainly is very smash mouth in his way. He is someone that he wants him to go into the DOJ, which might be the most, I guess, in Trump's view, maybe the worst offender of all the departments and agencies, and the way that, lawfare was handled and what the DOJ has done to him personally, he believes. And so I think having someone like Matt Gaetz go, and even before Matt Gaetz goes there, if he gets there, is to really, show that people are going to leave that building. They're going to leave those positions. If they are not lined eye to eye with President Trump, those lawyers, FBI agents, they're going to be out of there before they let Matt Gaetz fire them.
Indeed, if indeed he gets the job, as you correctly say, if he's nominated. But I just want to ask you a bit more about Gaetz, because, of course, you're an attorney yourself. And I just wonder whether you have full confidence that Matt Gaetz is the right person for that job.
Well, fortunately, I'm not a United States senator, so that's not my job. But that is the job of a United States senator, the role of advice and consent. And they are supposed to pour through all the information and really assess if this is the best person. But, people have to also understand that politics is in play, whether they like to admit it or not. These United States senators are up for re-election. And as I like to say, people are always about number one, especially people who are in Congress. They want to make sure they don't lose their jobs. And I can assure you that if Matt Gaetz has top cover from President Trump the way it appears that he does, Donald Trump is going to what we call whip for him. He's going to call and make calls to those United States senators. And whether it's him or his surrogates, he's going to have them know that if they don't support his nominees, that he will run a primary candidate against them, just as an example, or that their priority issue, whatever it may be for their state, may be on the chopping block, may not happen if he doesn't get their support for his nominees. So certainly, I think, we've always seen in every administration, there's one cabinet appointee that doesn't make it through. So, that always happens. That's not anything new with this administration or with previous administrations. That's the norm. And so there may be one, but Matt Gaetz, in a way, is very close with President Trump. And I think that he has proven himself in a way that Donald Trump had other options for DOJ attorney generals, and he chose Matt Gaetz. Certainly there were people with more legal skills and years in government and years of service as a lawyer, but he chose Matt Gaetz for a reason, because he is a disruptor.
Okay, so you don't sound worried about that appointment. What about the others? Let's turn our eye to RFK Jr. He says he's going to make America healthy again. Do you think he's going to achieve that goal?
I do. He's someone who's been around government for a long time, being a Kennedy. He's someone who is he's a very smart man. He knows what he knows, and he believes in certain things. He's an interesting pick because he's a Democrat. He certainly is someone who has very different positions that a lot of Republicans do, but he's very anti-industry, and so is Trump. Pharmaceutical industry, for example, I think that's, certainly him and President Trump are aligned on that. And so I think you're just going to see a lot of disruption there. I think there's a lot of concern within the outside broader community of healthcare providers that there's going to be a lot of changes. He is someone who is going to have, I think, both Democrats and Republicans are going to be asking him tough questions because he doesn't really have positions that fall into a box like a typical Republican or a typical Democrat. But he's someone who I believe has the ability to do something that we really need in this country, and that is to go after actually the food products that children are eating and adults are eating too, that are illegal in places like Europe, but they're legal in America. And of course, Fruit Loops being the perfect prime example that you've heard a lot about. But it's going through those types of foods that are illegal in other countries, banned in other countries, yet we consume them here. I think it'll be a breath of fresh air. I think a lot of people are kind of waiting and wanting to see someone who will go in and expose those things, and who better than someone like RFK Jr.
Yeah, sure. I mean, a lot of people we've spoken to in the last week or so have said that people like him and some of the other picks will look at old problems with a fresh pair of eyes. But we've also spoken to people in the ranks of the Republican Party who aren't altogether happy with some of these appointments. I mean, do you think it's fair to say that the Republican Party isn't universally supportive of all of the names on the list for the incoming administration?
Well, I mean, you're always going to have that. We're not, one-dimensional people, and people are always going to have their views. But you have people like Fetterman and really other members of the Democratic Party that have said, I've worked with Marco Rubio, and Marco Rubio would, be very good at this. So it really all comes down to what all is exposed during those nomination hearings. We've seen hearings go off the rails before, like with Kavanaugh and what the Democrats pulled there. So really, it's the role of the Senate is to bring about everything, discuss everything, and then make a determination of not who is the best, most perfect person in the world for this job. Is this the right person to get the job done right now? And I think that's where you'll see, people like Lindsey Graham, who have supported Democrats in the past. You will have Democrats on the other side of the aisle who will say, this is a person who can do this job. Again, you're not seeking perfection. It's not a 100%. It's someone who can get the job done right at this time. And again, when you have someone like President Trump, who is not ashamed, is not afraid to weigh in and tell these senators, I can make your life a living hell if you don't support it. Now, it's up to the senators. Ultimately, obviously, they get that, they have the vote. But again, it is something that President Trump, I believe, will whip on. And that will make a difference, because it will make it hard for senators who are up for re-election, or senators who have priority projects in their states they want to make sure that the president supports.
Yeah, and obviously one of the other appointments we've talked a lot about in the last week or so is Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, who's going to inherit a huge to-do list as he takes up that position, assuming he's confirmed. And specifically with relation to Ukraine, we've been hearing rhetoric, quite frightening rhetoric, use of the word World War III being used by Moscow and by Donald Trump Jr. to describe the situation that could unfold there. I mean, what's your thinking on where things could unfold with regards to Ukraine?
Well, I mean, I would say this about Pete Hegseth. He's someone who is another disruptor. But if you look at, 3 million employees at the Department of Defense, certainly a huge agency as far as numbers are concerned. But, they failed their seven most recent audits, just as an example. And so you really do need someone who's going to go in there. And it doesn't have to be someone who is, served in multiple wars, which, by the way, Pete Hegseth did. He did serve in 2 theaters. So this is someone who is experienced in combat. He's decorated. He's someone who has an Ivy League education. This is someone who can go in there and get things done. A lot of people think that he's the youngest, and though he is young, he is not the youngest. Don Rumsfeld is the youngest DOD secretary to ever serve back in 1975. So we've seen, young people serve before in these roles. And certainly I think that if you look at people in, for example, the current cabinet, someone like Pete Buttigieg, who is Secretary of the Department of Defense, he's someone who served abroad. He served our nation. He's a veteran. People said, okay, we'll let him be in charge of the Department of Transportation. What's the difference between him and Pete Hegseth? And I think you have to give people the opportunity, again, the United States Senate, give them the opportunity to, go through the process to make sure that they go through with a fine-tooth comb everything about these candidates for the position and let them make that decision.
Yeah, well, one difference is, of course, that Donald Trump has said that he can end the conflict in Ukraine within 24 hours of taking office, and that's going to be something that Pete Hegseth feels quite acutely by way of a pressure sort of lingering over him. Do you think they're going to be able to deliver?
I can't say, and I don't think anyone can say, but certainly that's what the president is thinking. That's what he wants to do. And that's something he's going to have to discuss with his advisors. He has key people advising him. They have to make that best decision for America. But look, this isn't different than where Donald Trump's been, for years on his stance and, really wanting to, not be a part of that. So I'm not surprised by it.
So what is the solution, therefore, in your opinion? A negotiated settlement by way during which Ukraine has to give up some of its territory? What do you think is the right answer?
I'm not the right person to ask that question. I'm really, that's not something that's in my wheelhouse. But I believe that, Donald Trump has campaigned on what he's campaigned on, and people voted for him by a wide majority. And so I think let him make that decision. Let him present that to the American people, and let's see where things go. But writing billion-dollar checks to Zelensky, I don't think is what the American people want.
Yeah, and of course the United States is a deeply divided country. I think that came across in the polls. A 50-50 split, and ultimately, the polls turned out to be wrong. But what is clear is that a lot of people won't be happy with the fact that there's a new administration, a new Trump administration on the way. How's Donald Trump going to bring Americans together and unite the country?
Well, look, I think he already has. You see how many people in the Native American community, in the African American community, in the Hispanic American community, in these communities that are typically not Republican. And I'm not saying they've become Republican, but they've moved towards the conservative values. And so I think they see someone like President Trump as a uniter, someone who's going to be able to bring the country together. And I think that something like what happened to President Trump, where his ear was grazed, he was almost killed on live TV, I think that changes people too. And I think that trauma that he experienced, it's a different perspective on life. And so I think you're going to see a little bit of a different Trump at the 2.0 version, and someone who really is trying to unite the country. And I think that's what you're going to see, a little bit different than Trump 1.0.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Amanda Mackey, great to have you with us.
Thank you.
Now, turning our eye to the Middle East. In Lebanon, a cautious calm has settled over the southern suburbs of Beirut as the US envoy is expected to visit the capital to try and secure a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hezbollah. Meanwhile, Hezbollah has confirmed the death of its media relations official, Mohammed Afif, who was killed in an Israeli strike on the Ras al-Naba neighborhood of Beirut. Well, the party issued a statement describing Afif as being one of the key figures in its media and political operations. Meanwhile, the World Bank has issued a report outlining the cost of this conflict to Lebanon so far. Well, let's find out more about this, and we can speak to Amin Salam, who is Lebanon's Minister of Economy and Trade. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, Minister. The World Bank says that the cost of this conflict is now somewhere in the region of $5.1 billion in economic losses, plus at least $3.4 billion worth of structural damage. So we're looking at a combined figure here of about $8.5 billion US. Does that sound right to you?
Well, thanks, Tom, for having me with you. Always a pleasure to join you. Let me start by saying I just returned from Washington 2 days ago after attending the annual meetings of the World Bank, IMF. And we have discussed those numbers thoroughly while we were visiting Washington, attending those meetings. I could tell you very honestly from the Lebanese government perspective as Minister of Economy and Trade, studying, assessing, and looking closely at the negative impact of the war on Lebanon, you can easily double those numbers. The World Bank numbers, based on their surveys, assessments, knowledge on the ground, projects in Lebanon, are very, very close to being accurate. However, I can tell you that if I am looking as Minister of Economy towards the part that is related to the GDP, medium to long term, if I'm looking at the unemployment rate, which is unprecedented, that's now over 50%, looking as well at the major sectors, tourism and agriculture, that are totally destroyed, I can tell you that this $8 billion can be easily doubled. We're looking at over $16 billion in my government's assessment, in the ministry's assessment, including everything. And the reason I say that with a lot of confidence is because I know that there are a lot of elements that the World Bank did not include in their report, not because they did not want to include it, but because they didn't, it was not part of their economic assessment. But it is what we do here, it is what we assess as a government. So adding up all the destruction, let me tell you as well, Tom, that day by day, those numbers are adding up very fast. So daily you're having mass destruction around the country, and that includes business institutions, that includes hospitals, that includes industries. So the numbers are growing by the day. That's why we are saying that we can easily double up those numbers. And if we keep going without a ceasefire until the end of the year, we're looking at much higher numbers, much higher numbers.
Okay, so you're basically saying that that number is way below the true cost. You also mentioned that certain sectors of the economy have been really severely damaged. You mentioned hospitality and tourism. Clearly no tourists are going to Lebanon at the moment. But are some sectors of the economy managing to remain somewhat resilient in the context of this war? And does that mean that some money is coming into Lebanon's coffers?
Well, as Minister of Economy and Trade, particularly I emphasize on the trade part. So we are monitoring very closely the import-export transactions, operations in the country, and that is the only, I can assure you, that is the only source of income today to the country, to the government. That is the only source of cash flow that is rotating, creating availability of cash in the country, which is the import-export of necessary goods like food supplies, day-to-day needs, everything that is, I mean, all what the people consume on a daily basis, including oil and gas, including most of the necessities, the basics, really. That is what is moving the economic cycle at this point, because the port and airport are still welcoming ships, welcoming airplanes, and the trade lines are still open. However, that remains to be a fear in case Israel decides to escalate and, for example, have a complete seize or siege on our import-export movement.
Yeah, obviously a huge cost to the country, not to mention the human cost as well. And even before this Israeli military operation began, Lebanon's economy has been in a critical condition for about 5 years prior to that. Large sections of the population have been pushed into poverty. I'm just wondering how people are managing to survive. How are people putting food on the table under these conditions?
Well, I can tell you, Tom, it's it's beyond what anyone can explain. Really, today, what the Lebanese people are passing through is devastating. And whoever tells you that contrary to that is not really describing the situation in the real form or shape that it is in today. The country is devastated. People lost their jobs. As I mentioned earlier, unemployment is at its highest, especially that you have over 1.5 million people today displaced. Out of those 1.5 million people, you have about 600,000 men and women lost their jobs. They have no paycheck. They have no money to put food on the table. They are relying today on the government's assistance. They are relying today on foreign aid, on food coming in airplanes, health aid coming in airplanes, and that's how they are surviving. I mean, there is a certain percentage of people in Lebanon, I would say no more than 20%, that have some reserves. I'm talking about money reserves, have some cash stored in their houses, in their homes, in their safe boxes that they are spending, but that is depleting without new money coming into the country, because most of the businesses today are frozen or closed or destroyed. So it is very difficult, and putting food on the table today is a major issue for a lot of people. We're talking millions of people.
I just want to talk about the situation on the ground, the military activity during the course of the weekend. There were fresh strikes on Beirut during the weekend, some of them, by the sounds of things, very intense strikes. And we also received reports that Hezbollah has been firing more projectiles into Israeli territory. I mean, none of this sounds conducive to sort of diplomatic channels and diplomatic paths that people might be considering. We're hearing that progress is being made on the diplomatic front. Nevertheless, what's your understanding of where things stand right now?
Well, in few interviews the past month, I stated very clearly, even before the U.S. elections, and I had numerous meetings on that front in Washington, D.C. during my visit. It has been made very clear to me in a very diplomatic way that there is a serious decision that has been taken. I'm talking on a regional basis to keep this operation going until Israel accomplishes its targets. Now, that means two things. First, the first scenario would be that there will be no ceasefire, no serious diplomatic discussions, even though we're expecting tomorrow or after tomorrow, Amos Hochstein to decide on a visit to Lebanon. But the first scenario would be that there will be no serious ceasefire before President-elect Donald Trump steps into the White House January 20, and he takes the lead on really making things happen, because he promised us while we were visiting Washington, and we were working very closely with him and his team on those future expectations or discussions, and he promised to make it happen. However, today, nothing is different than what we have seen the past year, Tom, of discussions in Gaza, of discussions in Lebanon. We keep going back and forth with changes in conditions, with changes in terms of the 1701 that makes the Lebanese side, a little more aggressive on accepting, like taking it negatively, I mean. So we hope, I can tell you, we hope, because Lebanon cannot tolerate another month of this situation, this escalation, this destruction, and its entire impact on the country. So we hope that there will be at least a beginning of a ceasefire or an entry approval, or a beginning or a preliminary approval for a ceasefire ASAP, because we need it. But I can still tell you that all the discussions about positive messages that we have heard the past 2 days are still not real until we see them happen.
Sure, but I mean, Amos Hochstein doesn't get to Lebanon until tomorrow. And, he has, it would appear, been making some progress behind the scenes. We understand that the Speaker of Parliament, Barratt, has also been working hard on the other side. You don't sound very optimistic that they're going to succeed in striking some sort of a ceasefire deal.
Well, I'm hoping for the best, Tom, and planning for the worst, because I've been monitoring all those visits, again, as I told you, for the past year, and most particularly for the past few months. And I just arrived from Washington, and we've had serious discussions there. And my feeling was that it's not going to be an easy path to a ceasefire. We're hoping that it will happen. We need it to happen. We're working to make it happen, but we have to be realistic. Tomorrow's Amos visit, I mean, I hope it will break the ice. It will create some, as I said, some accessibility to a real discussion for a ceasefire. But still, we have to be very cautious and plan for this to continue until Trump's administration is intact. Trump is in the White House, and then things will be more serious.
Yeah, I just want to ask you, you mentioned there Israel and its objectives in Lebanon. I mean, one of its objectives is to destroy Hezbollah. And just before we crossed you, we gave the news that Mohammed Afif, one of the latest senior officials in Hezbollah, has been killed. I mean, Hezbollah has been dealt blow after blow. Do you think Israel is now, therefore, close to having achieved its objective of destroying Hezbollah?
Well, to be quite honest, if we're talking about objectives, now I think that Israel has really accomplished. I think what they have accomplished even shocked them. They are surprised as to what they have accomplished so far on the Hezbollah front. But I can tell you, as Minister of Economy, being part of this government and looking into this and being someone who has been born within the struggle, 45 years ago, I left this country with my parents on the same objectives of Israel, even when Hezbollah was not even existent in Lebanon. So their objectives, in my own opinion, are beyond Hezbollah. There are objectives to, have control over the water in Lebanon, have control over more land in Lebanon, the seafront that can secure the oil and gas fields. So there are a lot of objectives. On top of that, there has been a total destruction of the Lebanese economy, Tom. The Lebanese economy has been targeted very badly. And as a responsible minister, I can tell you, to fight Hezbollah, a lot of the destruction did not need to happen. We have major destruction of major infrastructure in Lebanon, major sectors in Lebanon that are long gone, and they would need, a decade to come back.
Okay, well, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us once again here on Al Arabiya News. Amin Salam, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye. Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, bye-bye.
At Al Arabiya News, we go beyond the headlines.
From the latest breaking news to in-depth coverage of global events.
We're not bought or sold. Nobody owns us.
The loss of life, the destruction of property. The conflicts are such a terrible thing.
Context and analysis to help you see the full picture.
The world is in a very dangerous place.
Join us on Al Arabiya News,
It's very impressive.
where knowledge meets perspective.
Hello and welcome to Al Arabiya News. I'm your host, Michal Prendergast. I'm thrilled to say I'm joined by the star of Shark Tank USA and millionaire investor, Kevin O'Leary. So Kevin, the world has been shocked about the return of Donald Trump. Are you shocked?
No, no. The Democratic Party lost its way. They're no longer in touch with the electorate. There was a certain arrogance they had, and I think the problem started when Biden left the ticket, because in the democratic process, usually you have a convention, and so you start from scratch, and that process weeds out any weakness in candidates. If they have an inability to articulate their position, for example, or they're not able to debate their colleagues or whatever. But the other advantage of the convention, and there's been many very famous conventions back as far as the 40s, 50s, and 60s, is that the party realigns itself with a new message because it's trying to figure out what's the best candidate for the times. And they also get a tremendous amount of press, almost 5-6 weeks of press. That's not what happened here. What occurred was, I don't know if you want to call them the party elite, but the Pelosi's, the Schumers, the Obama,
the deep
even
state,
some movie stars, you know, they said, well, we're going to anoint Harris. And that was a mistake because Harris, well, a very fine person, I'm sure, has never won anything. And last time she tried this, she didn't get a single delegate. So in 2020, in 2019, she failed. 2020, she failed again in 2024. The analogy I think that is best serving this thing is the Super Bowl of all political contests on earth is the American presidential election. There's no greater political event on earth. And if your quarterback gets injured, which is what Biden was, you don't put in a new quarterback that's never played a game or ever won one, ever. They got shellacked, and they've learned an important lesson. I looked at that map, the electoral map, while covering the election. It was turning redder than a lobster being boiled. I mean, he just took the nation. And I think they're doing a little soul searching now. But they had it coming to them. And as I like to say, Trump did them a huge favor. He actually helped that party. They don't know it yet, but they're going to have to take a spatula to it and scrape all of those candidates away and start from scratch with new leadership. They'll be a very competitive party. There's a lot of talent in the Democratic Party that never got a chance to compete. Now they will.
Yeah, and speaking of Donald Trump, I've heard you say every Democrat has to thank him for saving American entrepreneurship and the American economy.
Yeah, the concept, some of the ideas being proposed, specifically taxing unrealized gains, that's un-American. The idea of price controls, Soviet-style price controls, that's un-American. The focus on gender identity was not the #1 concern of people that can't even afford chicken on their kitchen table. So when you get that lost, the system corrects itself, and that's exactly what happened. That's the amazing thing about democracy. When you try and stretch it too far in any direction, boom, it self-corrects. Now, you happen to be in the way of the self-correction, you get decimated, and that's what happened to that party.
Yes, and the effect of social media has been really interesting. Obviously, Elon Musk has played a huge part. Obviously, he paid $44 billion. Do you see that as a good investment in the future of free speech?
Well, as an investment, it wasn't a good investment because it's valued now at 11 to 12 billion. But that doesn't matter. What he did do is keep alive the concept of free speech, because in a democracy, you're always dealing with 2.5% lunatic fringe. The cost of freedom of speech is the lunatic fringe. The minute you try and shut down the lunatic fringe, you're moving away from the concept freedom of speech. Everybody has a voice. You may not like what they say, but because they're part of the narrative, that is the core and the DNA of democracy. And so many ideas get tested, some get thrown out. And when you try and change that, again, the system self-corrects, and that's what happened here. So it's a very divided country now. We are going to have a new president with a full mandate. I mean, it looks like he's going to win the Senate and the House and the presidency. You can get a lot done for the first 2 years when you control everything. And so that's what's going to happen.
And obviously Trump in his first 4 years, it might have been called a little inexperienced. I think this time he won't he won't mess around?
Well, he's actually signaled the market that he intends to hire seasoned veterans, AAA players, that don't have a mandate to go in the White House and write a book 6 weeks later after they're fired. He doesn't want that. He doesn't want a rotating door anymore. He wants A players, and he's grooming his, he's got some very interesting people working on the inside to find the right people for every single position in cabinet. And I think it's going to be a fantastic government because it's going to focus on what the people want. They want security at the border. They've already said that. They want a reduction in inflation. The way you do that is you reduce energy costs. They want to strip away all the regulatory environment that the Biden administration put on. $1 trillion worth of burdensome regulation. He will tear that off like a Band-Aid, rip it right off, and the economy, as you can see, indexed by the market, the buoyancy that happened as soon as they figured out that he was going to be president, was pretty happy with that outcome. This is good for business. And when the economy is buoyant and people are getting employed, it's good for everybody. So, you know, the Democrats are licking their wounds, but in 6 weeks, everybody forget about it, and we'll move on. It'll be a great thing for everybody. I think the U.S. is in a renaissance period. And I'm not really shilling for politicians. I never do that. I shill for policy. I care about policy. I care about entrepreneurship. I care about investing. I care about the American dream. I'm an ambassador for it. I want that to work because my family, you know, is American and they're working in the U.S. I want the best we can get for that country every day. And this is how you do it.
And speaking in terms of efficiency, Elon Musk has famously, he sacked or he got rid of 85% of Twitter, and it's still running pretty flawlessly. There's been a lot of speculation that he might get the Secretary of State for Government Efficiency. Would you like to see that? What could someone like Elon Musk do in terms of saving tax dollars?
I don't think he'll take an actual specific role in cabinet. I think what he will do is be a consultant for the American people, identify inefficiencies, and get the whacking stick out. I love that idea. I love the idea that we've never really scraped the fat out of the federal government, and it's big, porky, fat, dripping with opportunity to cut. But the only way you can do that is you need a mandate from the top dog, the president, because no agency wants to be downsized. You walk in saying, I want to fire a third of you. They're not going to help you. But he'll identify opportunity. I call it release the hounds, because what taxpayer, regardless of what your politics are, red or blue or independent, who wouldn't want to save money by just chopping out all the waste in the federal government? And I think if there's one man that has the ability to do that, proven executional skills, it's Elon Musk. So I really endorse this idea.
Well, I think it could be a great team, obviously, with Donald Trump and the art of the deal. To speak on the international scale, with tariffs, obviously it's a word that Trump has bandied around a lot. What does that mean for, I suppose, the average Joe in America and for the future of international trade? We're looking at China, we're looking at EV production. What do Trump's tariffs mean?
So tariffs were used as a form of rhetoric weaponry during the election cycle. Harris called them sales tax, like a VAT tax that we have in Europe. That's not what they are. In fact, there's a bill cruising around the Hill right now in the U.S. It's a tariff reciprocal act. And what it says is any of our trading partners that impose tariffs will put a reciprocal, identical tariff. So if Germany puts 10% on cars, we'll put 10% on their cars coming to the U.S., that kind of thing. And of course, there's a new act, the new NAFTA 2.0, if you want to call it that governs Canada, the United States, and Mexico, big trading partners. The one entity that I think you're going to see a lot more pressure on is China. China doesn't abide by the rules of the WTO. They joined in 1999 with all kinds of promises to play by the rules. They never did. So I'm an advocate for using tariffs to squeeze their heads like teenage pimples. And the way I point that out is to say, look, the only way a supreme leader stays in power perpetually is everybody has bread and butter. You have to have a job. Otherwise, you ride against the supreme leader. And that's just the way it is in a communist dictatorship. So the way you squeeze the supreme leader's head is you say, look, let's pick a sector. I'm just going to use an example. Yoga mats. Let's say the U.S. orders 1 million yoga mats a week from China. You put a 400% tariff on it. And all the people making yoga mats in China lose their jobs. And they don't have any bread and butter anymore. And the Supreme Leader goes, oh my goodness, I don't have any jobs for these yoga mat makers. And then you say, well, where else can we inflict some damage? Let's do it in this sector. Put on 400% tariff there. Squeezing that teenage pimple till it pops. Then he gets on an airplane and flies to Washington saying, just kidding, just kidding. I want to work out and be part of the, Reciprocal Tariff Act. Because China only understands the stick. They don't understand anything else.
It's a game of chicken.
Well, Trump scares his adversaries because he's unpredictable. He just very unpredictable. When you know what your adversary is going to do all the time and they signal it to you beforehand, you're not scared of him anymore. They're scared shitless of Trump. And that's, excuse my French, but that's basically how it works. That's why you're seeing all these guys saying, oh, we want to have peace now. No, we want to stop. Because he's very unpredictable. So in the case of China, squeezing the Supreme Leader to the table is a good thing. So I would like to go to 400% tariffs. Because I do business in China. They don't play by the rules.
And how about on EVs? Because obviously, even a 20% or even a 30% tariff on EVs, I believe in the EU, they're trying to flood the market. Obviously, Germany's not happened. We've seen Volkswagen cut 1,000 jobs in 2 months ago.
The point is, tariffs are temporary. They're a negotiating tactic. But if you're going to put them on, don't screw around. Go to 400%. Make it impossible for them to sell any widgets anywhere. So if you put 400% on an EV, no one's going to buy it. Only the Chinese can buy it. So all the people making the EVs, no bread, no butter. That's how you do it. Now, if I was the minister of Chinese head squeezing, that's how I would do it. And believe me, they will be at the table so fast because they cannot afford to have unemployment in that economy. And it's showing some cracks there. So you want to hit them while they're down and bring them to the table. They cheat on IP, they steal. You can't use their courts. A good example that people should focus on is Twitter, or not Twitter, but TikTok. TikTok has been deemed Chinese spyware by the American Congress. That's a bipartisan bill. By midnight on Jan 19th in the US, the servers are going to get turned off.
I've heard you say as well that you would like to buy it by a consortium. Do you want to buy Twitter?
Yeah,
TikTok?
I would definitely buy TikTok. I would buy it because it's a great, it depends what I get with it. If I don't get the algorithm, all I'm getting is a mailing list, so I pay a lot less for that. But we'll see how this goes because remember, they did this in India. After 4 years, they had 200 million users on it, and the Supreme Leader would not, play by the rules with the Indian government, and they said, we'll just turn it off. And everybody was squeamish for a week, and then they forgot about it. They just drifted onto other social media platforms. So again, squeezing the Supreme Leader's head there is good, and it is spyware. I would never put that on a phone that I have sensitive data on. It's Chinese spyware. Everybody knows that. That's why it's shut down. They just shut it down in Canada. I mean, they're going to shut it down everywhere. But this is the arrogance of the Supreme Leader. He doesn't care. So you've got to squeeze his head. He will appreciate the head squeezing. He will thank you for it.
And is it the same, obviously, with the likes of Vladimir Putin and the war between Israel and Hamas? War is not good for business. Do you think Trump is going to have a large enough impact? He said famously, I will stop the wars within the first day of office. Do you think that's true?
Putin understands force. Not a very nice guy. He's killed a lot of people. But 25,000 young Russians a month lose their lives. He's buying their services now. There's no more patriots left. You get coffin money, your family gets a house, but you go die or get blown up. That's pretty brutal. So I would think giving him a call and saying, look, I've been thinking about this war. I don't like it. I don't want to pay for the Ukrainian costs, and I want it to stop. Come to the table, or I'll do something that will really surprise you, which is probably what people worry about with Trump, because we saw how he ended the Syrian conflict by just saying, I'm going to kill this guy. And he did. And I think that kind of erratic nature is what these adversaries worry about. Now, a lot of NATO players don't like to hear this, but I think war's horrible. I think all these people and children losing their lives is horrible. It's just somebody has to stop this.
Exactly, and on a human level, but as well as
obviously
markets. So it affects the bread and butter as well. So you're taking food off of people's tables, affecting jobs, as well as the human suffering. It's bad all around.
It is. So I think people are willing to try a different way. Now, whether Trump's successful or not, we'll see. But this carnage of death of young children, I can't watch it anymore. No one can.
Of course.
It's got to stop.
Then, moving on to cryptocurrency, we've seen markets as well as the price of Bitcoin increase. It broke $72,000, I believe, in the past few days. Do you believe under Trump, what is the height that you think it can get to under a Trump presidency?
So Trump has signaled, and the market knows this, that he is in favor of digital payment system, which includes Bitcoin, which is an asset class. I'm not saying that's a digital payment system, but it's no different than gold. I mean, you can own some gold, you can own some Bitcoin. I own both. What the problem is, we don't have institutional support for it yet because it's not regulated in the U.S. The way other commodities are. So the rumor on the street is that the CFTC, which regulates commodities, is going to get the mandate for crypto, and they're looking for someone to run it. And they'll probably take a lot of that away from Gensler at the SEC, who's been litigating this sector, and successfully, I might add. He's, all the crypto cowboys, like Binance, CZ, he's a felon now. You know what happened to Sam Bankman-Fried. So people that took on Gensler all lost, and this is probably a good thing. So we move into a phase now where it's going to be regulated. There's a lot of optimism about it. Here in Abu Dhabi, we have the M2 exchange, which is a very interesting idea because it's completely compliant with its regulator. I see a lot of upside coming in crypto.
And a figure, just briefly, do you think, what's the limit? Do you think it can reach 200K under a Trump presidency?
I think we'll all see 100,000 shortly. I feel everybody should have 5% weighting in gold in their portfolio. Nothing wrong with 5% weighting in Bitcoin. I mean, why not? I mean, unless you really think, and you don't have to do this, I'm just saying alternative asset classes in times of uncertainty and inflation are good. I mean, I own gold and I've had it my whole life. I was given a locket from my Irish father when I was 11 years old that had a gold coin in it. That's when I fell in love with it. I've had that ever since. And I own bullion, I own ETFs. I mean, gold is gold. The Romans loved it, I love it. Bitcoin is the new. It's not as old as gold, but it's performed very well for me.
Yeah. And just lastly, speaking on gold, obviously to have Kevin O'Leary, Mr. Wonderful in the studio, it would be a shame if I didn't ask about watches. You are, I would say, the most famous watch collector in the world now, doing millions of views on YouTube every month with the likes of Teddy Baldassar. He has just opened his new watch shop. I want to ask you, would you ever think of entering the watch strap business? The red bands are... They're synonymous with you.
It's a great question, but what I've learned about watch collecting and getting access, I mean, the thing that in my journey into horology is, in order to get watchmakers that are really unique, who make only a few pieces a year, you need to be known as a collector. And what does that mean? It means that you support the art. It's no different than contemporary art, and you don't flip them. So flipping a watch, when you get a reputation for buying it at the entry price from the watchmaker and then turning around and selling it for 4 times that the next week, you're not a collector. You're just a flipper. And the watch community is very small. It's in terms of the makers, there's probably 25 makers of consequence worldwide. The word gets out overnight that you're not a real collector. And so it takes a long time to earn the trust of an F.P. Journe or a Simon Britt or any of these makers. And I'm known I've never sold a watch. And so I have a very vast collection, and I'm a dial guy, as you know. So I'm always looking for the new dial. I'm wearing a Moser, a unique dial here. And of course, this is a classic Daytona. I thought, this is New York time, this is Abu Dhabi time. And so I support... The thing about getting into the business of retailing watches or retailing bands is all of a sudden...
I'd buy it, Kevin.
Yeah, no, I'm
100%.
You're no
I'll pay a
longer
pretty
a
penny for an O'Leary
no,
band.
But I'm very fortunate. Every watch company knows I won't wear it unless it has a red band. So They don't even offer me watches if they can't put a red band on. I would never buy them. So my whole thing's red band because it looks fantastic. Great with gold, great with platinum. I mean, this looks gorgeous. Works with my red.
Of course.
I just wonder if
like on Shark Tank.
Yeah, the whole thing is, you know, it's just over the years it's become one of my things. But each maker, watches are really a beautiful thing because they mark a period in your life. Every time I do a big deal, I buy a new watch, and I associate that deal with that watch. And you know, my daughters try and steal them, my wife, my son. Nobody gets to touch my watches. Like, that's it. That's the one thing that I've got. They're in vaults all around the world, you know, and I just love it. I just have so much fun. And the reason I like it is the community of watch collectors that I know all around the world are very eclectic. Surgeons, artists, financiers, royalty, you name it. And
journalists?
Yes, journalists. We share the passion of watches, and I think it enriches my life.
Great. Kevin O'Leary, a millionaire investor, host of the Smash Hit Show at Shark Tank. Thank you so much for your time.
You got it. Thank you.
From the White House to Gaza, Kyiv to Beijing, elections, economics and the environment compete with conflicts and other complex issues for our attention. In an age of fake news, deepfake and artificial intelligence,
they've got to have a vote and a say.
It's important to look beyond the loudest voice to understand the truth. From newsmakers to groundbreakers,
my campaign is going very well.
Presidents, prime ministers, princes and peacemakers, and cultural tastemakers.
As Arabs,